Welcome back, my friend. Before we start the video, I really need your support. The channel is going through a tough time, and your help means everything. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone watching leaves just one like and one comment, we can easily make it happen. Don't forget to subscribe as well. And now, let's get started. I've always found peace in the rolling hills of Shenandoah National Park, where in 2019, at the age of 34, I spent most of my days patrolling the trails and ensuring visitors respected the land. My name is Ezekiel Harper, but most folks just call me Zeke. Growing up in a small Virginia town, I developed a love for the outdoors early on, thanks to my grandpa who taught me everything from fishing to identifying bird calls. Of course, I never quite mastered the art of starting a campfire without singeing my eyebrows, a talent that earned me a few laughs around the ranger station. Shenandoah National Park spans nearly 200,000 acres of protected wilderness, a tapestry of dense forests, cascading waterfalls and serene meadows. It's a place where the chaos of the modern world fades away, replaced by the rhythmic songs of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the gentle Appalachian breeze. But as I would soon discover, even the most tranquil wilderness can harbor dark secrets. On a crisp October morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like a spectral reminder of summer's passing, I received my assignment for the day. I was to check the remote segments of the Appalachian Trail that wound through our park. The leaves were at their peak, painting the landscape in a riot of amber, crimson, and gold. Hikers from all over the country flocked to catch this autumn spectacle, their excited chatter filling the main trails and popular overlooks. As I prepared my gear for the day's patrol, my colleague Laura Jenkins joined me. Laura was a sharp-witted ranger with a penchant for bad puns and an uncanny ability to spot wildlife before anyone else. She once joked that between the two of us we had one fully functioning brain, hers mostly, of course. Ready for another thrilling day of making sure tourists don't try to take selfies with bears? Laura quipped as she shouldered her pack. I chuckled, double-checking my first aid kit. Hey, someone's got to keep Yogi and Boo Boo in line. Did you hear about the group that tried to feed a skunk last week? Laura grimaced. Oh yeah, that ended about as well as expected. I still can't get the smell out of my nostrils. As we set off down the trail, leaving behind the bustling visitor center, Laura couldn't resist unleashing her latest joke. Hey Zeke, did you hear about the mathematician who's afraid of negative numbers? I braced myself, knowing resistance was futile. No, Laura, I didn't. Do tell. He'll stop at nothing to avoid them. She grinned, clearly pleased with herself. I groaned, shaking my head. Your jokes are like the park's compost heap, Laura. Ripe and recycled. She laughed, undeterred. But like compost, they help things grow. In this case, your appreciation for quality humor. As we hiked deeper into the park, the sounds of chattering tourists faded away, replaced by the subtle symphony of the forest. The trail narrowed, winding its way through stands of towering oaks and maples. The canopy above grew denser, dappling the forest floor with intricate patterns of light and shadow. Our destination was a less traveled path where a few campers had reported strange noises at night. Normally, such reports wouldn't raise much concern. Nocturnal animals often sound strange to city dwellers unused to the ways of the wild. But there had been an unusual frequency to these reports lately, all clustered around the same area. Probably just a bear with insomnia, I remarked as we veered off the main trail onto a narrower path. Or maybe a particularly vocal owl with a grudge against campers. Laura nodded, her usual joking demeanor replaced by a more serious expression. Maybe. But remember that deer carcass we found last month? The one that looked like it had been torn apart by something big? I did remember, and the memory sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. We had written it off as a bear attack at the time, but something about the way the animal had been mauled had seemed off. The wounds were too precise, too calculated for a typical predator. As we pressed deeper into the less traveled sections of the park, an uneasy feeling began to settle over me. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds and small creatures, seemed unnaturally quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional groan of branches swaying in the wind. You notice how quiet it is? Laura whispered, voicing my own thoughts. I nodded, my hand instinctively moving to rest on the bear spray attached to my belt. Yeah, it's like Mother Nature hit the mute button. We pushed on, the trail becoming rougher and less defined. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers, creating a claustrophobic canopy above us. The air grew cooler and a thin mist began to gather around our feet, adding an ethereal quality to the already eerie atmosphere. After about an hour of hiking, we reached a small clearing. What we found there stopped us in our tracks. An abandoned campsite lay before us, but it was unlike any I had seen in my years as a ranger. The tent was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters. Personal belongings were scattered across the clearing as if a tornado had torn through the site. A backpack lay nearby, ripped open, its contents strewn about. Laura knelt to examine claw marks on a nearby tree. "Looks like a bear got here," she remarked, but her tone lacked conviction. I joined her, studying the marks. Something felt off. The claw marks were unusually high, far higher than any black bear in the region could reach. And the spacing? It didn't match any animal I knew. "That's odd," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Black bears around here don't get that tall." Laura attempted to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's a bear on stilts. The circus is in town after all." I forced a chuckle. Either that or Bigfoot finally decided to go camping. We cataloged the site, took photographs, and collected what we could. I radioed back to the station to report our findings. Our supervisor, Frank Reeves, instructed us to keep investigating but to stay alert. As we moved on from the clearing, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees pressed closer, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more of the sky. The mist thickened, curling around our ankles like ghostly tendrils. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly scanning our surroundings, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. Little did I know that this day would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. As we ventured further into the heart of Shenandoah, I couldn't have imagined the horrors that awaited us in the deceptive tranquility of these ancient Appalachian forests. As Laura and I pressed deeper into the less traveled areas of Shenandoah, the forest around us underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The familiar trails and landmarks we had known for years seemed to shift and change, as if the very landscape was conspiring to disorient us. We reached a narrow ravine bridged by a fallen log. Below, a shallow stream trickled over moss-covered rocks, its gentle burbling the only sound in the oppressive silence of the forest. I went first, carefully balancing as I crossed. Laura followed, but halfway across she froze. "Zeke, do you smell that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I paused, inhaling deeply. There was a faint but unmistakable odor, acrid and unnatural. It reminded me of sulfur mixed with the sickly sweet scent of decay. "Yeah, I smell it. Maybe something died nearby." Laura grimaced. Comforting thought. Thanks for that. As we reached the other side of the ravine, something caught my eye. There, in a patch of soft soil, were a series of impressions unlike anything I'd seen in my years as a ranger. They were footprints, but not from any animal native to these woods. I knelt to examine them more closely, my heart pounding. The prints were elongated, easily twice the size of a human foot. But it was their shape that truly unnerved me. Each print had 4 toes ending in sharp points that dug deep into the earth. Whatever had left these tracks walked on 2 legs, but it was certainly no bear or other known predator. "Okay, that's definitely not a bear," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my efforts to remain calm. Laura snapped photos of the prints, her usual joking demeanor replaced by focused professionalism. "Could be a prank," she suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Some teenager with a homemade mold trying to spook hikers." I shook my head. "Maybe, but why go through all that trouble out here? We're miles from any popular trails." We decided to follow the tracks, a decision that in hindsight would prove to be the beginning of our descent into a waking nightmare. As we moved forward, the strange prints led us further off the established paths and deeper into the untamed heart of the forest. The smell we had noticed earlier grew stronger, an omnipresent miasma that seemed to cling to our clothing and skin. The trees around us bore more of the high claw marks we had seen at the abandoned campsite, some so high up that whatever made them must have been able to reach well over 10 feet. "Feels like we're being herded," Laura observed, her voice tight with tension. I nodded, trying to keep my own growing unease in check. Toward what, though? Laura attempted a weak joke. Probably a surprise party. Rangers of the Year awards, you know. I played along, grateful for any distraction from the oppressive atmosphere. Great. I hope they have cake. We reached another clearing, this one dominated by a massive ancient oak tree. Its gnarled branches reached out in all directions, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the fading daylight. At the base of the tree lay a sight that turned my blood to ice. The remains of a deer, or what was left of it, sprawled across the leaf-strewn ground. But this was no ordinary predator kill. The carcass was mutilated beyond recognition, deep gashes exposing bone and sinew. What struck me most was the precision of the wounds. This wasn't the frenzied attack of a hungry animal, but something far more deliberate and unsettling. Jesus, Laura breathed, her face pale. No animal does this. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. In all my years in these woods, I had never seen anything like this. It defied explanation, and that terrified me more than any known danger ever could. We should head back, I said, my mouth dry. Report this and get a team out here. Laura nodded, clearly as eager as I was to put some distance between us and this grisly scene. But as we turned to leave, a sound echoed through the trees that stopped us in our tracks. It was a low rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. It was unlike anything I had ever heard in nature. Not the growl of a bear or the howl of a wolf, but something altogether alien and terrifying. What was that? Laura asked, her eyes wide with fear. I struggled to keep my voice steady. Probably just the wind playing tricks, I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. The noise came again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind. It was more like the reverberation of heavy machinery, but there was no equipment for miles. Whatever was making that sound was alive, and it was moving towards us. We need to move, I urged, grabbing Laura's arm. We retraced our steps, but something was wrong. The path we had taken seemed different, unfamiliar. Landmarks we had passed were gone, replaced by dense underbrush and towering trees that I was certain hadn't been there before. Did we take a wrong turn? Laura asked, her voice edged with panic. I shook my head, confusion and fear warring for dominance in my mind. I don't think so. It's like the forest changed. Laura shot me an incredulous look. Forests don't just rearrange themselves, Zeke. Tell that to this one, I muttered. The rumbling noise followed us, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly near. Shadows flickered at the edge of our vision, but whenever we turned to look, there was nothing there. It was as if the forest itself was toying with us, leading us deeper into its twisted heart. Maybe we should radio for help, Laura suggested, a tremor in her voice betraying her growing fear. I reached for my radio, but all I got was static. The device crackled and hissed, useless in the face of whatever strange forces were at work in these woods. That's not good, I said, frustration and fear coloring my words. Laura attempted a weak smile. Of course, the one time we need technology, it fails us. On the bright side, we won't have to file those tedious reports if we never make it back. I appreciated her attempt at humor, dark as it was. Desperate times call for desperate jokes, I guess. We pressed on, our pace quickening as the light began to fade. The thought of being out here after dark with that thing stalking us was more than I could bear. We broke into a jog, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before us, each turn revealing only more trees, more shadows, more unknown dangers. Then we heard it, a scream. A man's voice, raw and terrified, echoing through the trees. Laura and I stopped dead in our tracks, exchanging a look of horror. Without a word, we both knew we had to investigate. Whatever personal fears we had were overshadowed by our duty as rangers, and the possibility that someone else was in danger. We ran toward the sound, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. Bursting through a thicket, we stumbled upon a scene that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Another ranger, Ben Morales, lay on the ground. His uniform was torn to shreds, and he clutched at his leg, which was bleeding profusely. The look of terror on his face made my blood run cold. "Ben, what happened?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He gasped, his words coming in pained bursts. "Something attacked me. It came out of nowhere. So fast, so strong." Laura ripped open her pack, pulling out the first aid kit. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. As she worked on Ben's wounds, I scanned our surroundings, every sense on high alert. "Did you see what it was?" I asked, dreading the answer. Ben winced as Laura applied pressure to his leg. "It was huge," he said, his voice shaking. "Like a wolf, but bigger. And it walked on two legs sometimes." I exchanged a glance with Laura. A bipedal wolf-like creature? It sounded impossible, like something out of a horror movie. But after what we had seen today, I wasn't ready to dismiss anything. "Maybe you hit your head," I suggested gently, though I was starting to believe that something truly inexplicable was stalking these woods. Ben's eyes flashed with anger. "I'm not crazy," he snapped. "It chased me. I think it got Sam." Laura's hands froze. "Sam's out here too?" Ben nodded weakly. He radioed for backup. I was closest. I muttered a curse under my breath. This was no longer just a strange wildlife situation. We were dealing with a genuine emergency, possibly multiple rangers down, and an unknown predator unlike anything we had ever encountered. "We need to get back," I said, helping Ben to his feet. "Can you walk?" He grimaced but nodded. "I'll manage." We made slow progress, the forest now cloaked in deepening shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig kept us on edge. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being herded, driven towards some unknown destination by an intelligence that was anything but animal. As we moved, the forest grew even darker and more foreboding. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snag our clothing. The mist that had been swirling around our feet earlier now rose higher. The mist that had been swirling around our feet earlier now rose higher, obscuring the path ahead and muffling sounds in an eerie way. Our progress was painfully slow, hampered by Ben's injury and our own growing exhaustion and fear. "Knock, knock," Laura whispered suddenly, her voice tight with tension. "Now's not the time," I hissed, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But Ben, perhaps trying to distract himself from the pain, played along. "Who's there?" "Interrupting Ranger," Laura started, but I quickly cut her off with a sharp shh. We fell silent, straining our ears. In the distance, I could hear something moving through the underbrush. It was too deliberate to be the random movements of wildlife, too heavy to be anything native to these woods. Ahead, the trees parted to reveal another clearing. In the center stood a figure that made my blood run cold. It was hunched over something on the ground, its massive form silhouetted against the dim light. "Is that Sam?" Ben whispered, hope and fear mingling in his voice. I squinted, trying to make out details in the fading light. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that what we were looking at was no human. The figure was tall, easily over 7 feet, with limbs that were too long and bent at unnatural angles. It was covered in matted fur that gleamed dully in the twilight, giving it an otherworldly appearance. As we watched, frozen in terror, the creature lifted its head. I caught a glimpse of a snout filled with sharp teeth, blood dripping from its maw. Its eyes reflected what little light remained, glowing with an eerie, intelligent malevolence. "That's definitely not Sam," I breathed, my voice barely audible. The creature let out a sound that defied description, a mix between a howl and a roar that sent chills through my entire body. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and primal rage. "Run," Laura hissed, already backing away. We turned to flee, but Ben stumbled, his injured leg giving out. The noise was enough to alert the creature. Its head snapped in our direction, those glowing eyes fixing on us with predatory focus. "Go," I shouted, grabbing Ben under the arm to support him. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that monstrosity. I could hear it pursuing us, its heavy footfalls gaining ground with terrifying speed. "Any brilliant ideas?" Laura shouted as we ran. "Just one," I replied, my lungs burning. "Don't get caught." "Solid plan," she shot back, a hint of her usual sarcasm breaking through the fear. We burst into another clearing, and I felt a surge of hope. An old fire tower stood before us, its metal frame a beacon of potential safety. Up there, I pointed, already angling towards it. We scrambled up the stairs, the metal structure shaking under our combined weight and the force of our desperate ascent. Reaching the top, we pulled up the ladder just as the creature emerged from the tree line. It circled below, those unnatural eyes never leaving us. It let out another of those bone-chilling roars, then began to claw at the tower's legs. The entire structure swayed alarmingly. "How long do you think this will hold?" Ben asked, his face pale with pain and fear. Laura, ever the optimist even in dire situations, quipped, "Long enough for us to regret our life choices." "I hope." I scanned the small cabin at the top of the tower, looking for anything we could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on an old flare gun tucked away in a dusty corner. "There's a flare gun here," I announced, grabbing it and checking to see if it was loaded. "Maybe it enjoys fireworks," Laura said, her voice strained. I nodded grimly. Better than nothing. Loading the flare gun, I moved to the edge of the platform. The creature was still circling, occasionally rearing up to slash at the tower's supports. I took aim, steeling myself. "Hey, ugly!" I shouted. As it looked up, I fired. The flare arced through the air, striking the creature's shoulder. It burst into bright sparks, momentarily illuminating the clearing in harsh red light. The monster howled in pain and rage, retreating into the shadows of the surrounding forest. "Well, that bought us some time," Laura said, peering into the darkness below. "Time for what?" Ben asked, slumped against the railing. "We're still stuck up here." I grabbed the radio, hoping against hope that the height of the tower would help boost the signal. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Harper. We are under attack by an unknown creature. Request immediate assistance at the old fire tower near Marker 12. For a moment, there was only static. Then, miraculously, a voice crackled through. "Copy that, Harper. This is Reeves. Hold tight. We're dispatching a team." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. We still had to survive until help arrived. And I had no doubt that the creature was still out there, waiting. The minutes crawled by like hours as we huddled in the tower, straining our eyes and ears for any sign of the monster's return. The forest below was eerily quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath. "I once thought the scariest thing in these woods was a raccoon with an attitude," I said. Trying to break the tension, Laura managed a weak smile. "Remind me to file a complaint about the lack of monsters ahead signs." Just then, we heard a welcome sound, sirens in the distance, followed by the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades. A searchlight pierced through the canopy, sweeping over the clearing. "Over here!" we shouted and waved frantically. As the light passed over us, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. The creature had reappeared, its eyes reflecting the harsh light. It snarled, a sound of frustration and rage before melting back into the shadows of the forest. A team of rangers and local law enforcement arrived, weapons drawn and flashlights sweeping the area. Frank Reeves, our supervisor, called up to us. "Are you all okay?" "Been better," I called back, relief evident in my voice. "But we're alive." As they secured the area and helped us down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? And what exactly was that creature that had stalked us through the forest? Little did I know, this night was just the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and the ancient forests of Shenandoah. The next few days passed in a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. Ben was hospitalized for his injuries, while Laura and I were subjected to a battery of tests and interviews. The official investigation was in full swing, but I could tell from the skeptical looks and carefully worded questions that many doubted our account of what had happened in the forest. Frank Reeves, our supervisor, called Laura and me into his office 3 days after the incident. As we settled into the chairs across from his desk, I couldn't help but notice how tired he looked. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled. "I'm going to be straight with you two," he began, his voice grave. "What you've reported, it's unprecedented. We've had our share of strange occurrences in the park, but nothing like this." I leaned forward, hope rising in my chest. "So you believe us?" Reeves sighed, rubbing his temples. "I believe that you believe what you saw. But Zeke, Laura, you have to understand how this sounds to everyone else. A giant bipedal creature that can seemingly disappear into the forest? It's unbelievable." Laura finished for him, her voice tight. "We know how it sounds, Frank, but we know what we saw. And what about the evidence? I added, the tracks, the claw marks, Ben's injuries? Reeves nodded slowly. We're analyzing everything. The forensics team is going over the sites you reported, and we've got wildlife experts examining the tracks and other physical evidence. But so far, nothing conclusive. I felt a surge of frustration. What about Sam? Has there been any sign of him? A shadow passed over Reeves's face. No. We've had search teams combing the area, but nothing. It's like he vanished into thin air. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. Sam was an experienced ranger, someone who knew the park like the back of his hand. For him to disappear without a trace, and so what happens now? Laura asked, breaking the tense silence. Reeves leaned back in his chair. For now, we're keeping this under wraps. The official story is that there was an animal attack, possibly a bear. We don't need panic spreading among the visitors or the local community. I started to protest, but Reeves held up a hand to stop me. I know, Zeke. But until we have more concrete evidence, we can't go public with tales of unknown creatures in the park. It would cause chaos. As much as I hated to admit it, I knew he was right. But the thought of keeping quiet, of pretending that nothing out of the ordinary had happened, sat like a lead weight in my stomach. What about us? Laura asked. Are we going back on duty? Reeves nodded. Yes, but not in the backcountry. I'm assigning you both to visitor center duty for the next few weeks. I think some time away from the deep woods might do you good. I wanted to argue, to insist that we needed to be out there searching for answers. But the exhaustion of the past few days caught up with me, and I found myself nodding in agreement. As we left Reeves's office, Laura turned to me. Visitor center duty? Seriously? We should be out there, Zeke. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I know, Laura, but maybe Reeves is right. We need to regroup, gather our thoughts. And who knows, maybe being at the visitor center will give us a chance to hear if any visitors have had strange experiences. Laura nodded reluctantly. I suppose. But I don't like it. It feels like we're abandoning Sam. The mention of our missing colleague sent a pang of guilt through me. We're not abandoning him, I said, trying to convince myself as much as Laura. The search teams are still out there, and we'll keep our ears to the ground. If there's any news, any strange reports, we'll be the first to know. The next few weeks passed slowly. Laura and I fell into a routine at the visitor center, answering questions about hiking trails and campsite availability. But beneath the surface of normalcy, tension simmered. Every time a visitor mentioned hearing strange noises at night or seeing unusual tracks, my heart would race. But each report turned out to be nothing more than normal wildlife activity or overactive imaginations. One evening, as we were closing up the center, Laura approached me with a determined look in her eye. Zeke, we need to talk. I nodded, sensing the seriousness in her tone. We walked out to the parking lot, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I've been doing some research, Laura began, her voice low, looking into local legends, folklore about the park, and I found something interesting. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of something? She glanced around as if afraid of being overheard. There are old stories going back generations about something in these woods. The locals called it the Shannon Demon. I couldn't help but chuckle at the name despite the seriousness of the situation. Shannon Demon? Sounds like a bad B-movie monster. Laura shot me an exasperated look. I'm serious, Zeke. The descriptions in these stories, they match what we saw. A large bipedal creature that stalks the deep woods. There are accounts of missing hikers, mutilated animals, strange noises in the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. How far back do these stories go? Centuries, Laura replied. The Native American tribes in this area had legends about a malevolent spirit that roamed the forests. When European settlers arrived, they brought their own folklore that seems to have merged with the native stories. I leaned against my truck, trying to process this information. So you think what we encountered is some kind of, what, cryptid? Urban legend come to life? Laura shook her head. I don't know what to think. But I do know that we can't just sit here handing out trail maps while that thing is out there. We need to investigate further. I nodded slowly, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement building in my chest. You're right. But we need to be smart about this. If Reeves finds out we're poking around, then we don't let him find out, Laura said, a determined glint in her eye. We do this on our own time, off the books. As I agreed to Laura's plan, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping onto a path that would change our lives forever. The tranquil forests of Shenandoah had revealed a dark secret. and we were about to plunge headfirst into a mystery that had lurked in these ancient woods for centuries. Little did we know, our decision that evening would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not only our understanding of the natural world, but also our very survival. The Shan'an demon, if that's truly what we were dealing with, was about to become more than just a legend. It was about to become our waking nightmare. The weeks that followed our conversation in the parking lot were a blur of clandestine research and carefully planned excursions into the park's backcountry. Laura and I used our days off to venture deeper into the forests, always under the guise of routine patrols or personal hiking trips. We started by revisiting the areas where we had encountered the creature, meticulously documenting everything we found. The claw marks on the trees were still visible, though weathered by time and the elements. We took photographs, made plaster casts of the few tracks we could find, and collected samples of fur and other organic material we discovered. Our off-duty hours were spent poring over old records, local history books, and online forums dedicated to cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. The more we dug, the more we realized that the legend of the Shan'an demon was more widespread than we had initially thought. One crisp autumn evening, about a month into our covert investigation, Laura and I met at a small diner just outside the park boundaries. The place was nearly empty, save for a few tired-looking truckers nursing cups of coffee at the counter. "Look at this," Laura said as soon as I slid into the booth across from her. She pushed a stack of printouts towards me. I leafed through the papers, my eyes widening as I took in the information. They were reports of missing persons cases in and around Shenandoah National Park, dating back decades. "There's a pattern here," Laura explained, her voice low and intense. "Every few years there's a spike in disappearances. Always in the same general area of the park, always during the late fall or early winter months." I nodded slowly, the implications sinking in. "And let me guess, the official explanations are always the same. Animal attacks, hikers getting lost?" Laura tapped her nose. "Exactly. But look at this." She pulled out a map of the park covered in red dots. Each dot represents a disappearance or a reported sighting of something unusual. "See how they cluster?" I leaned in, studying the map. The red dots formed a rough circle around a remote area of the park, a section so dense and rugged that even experienced hikers rarely ventured there. It's like it has a territory," I murmured, a chill running down my spine. Laura nodded grimly. "That's what I was thinking. And look at this." She pointed to a spot near the center of the circle. "There's an old fire road here, abandoned decades ago. It leads to an area that used to be used for logging back in the early 1900s. I raised an eyebrow. "You think that's where it lives?" "I think it's worth checking out," Laura replied, a determined glint in her eye. I sat back, running a hand through my hair. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was madness, that we were chasing shadows and letting our imaginations run wild. But I couldn't shake the memory of that night in the forest, the sight of that monstrous figure hunched over its prey. "When do we go?" I asked, knowing I'd regret the words even as I spoke them. Laura's face lit up with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "I was thinking this weekend. We both have Saturday and Sunday off. We can tell Reeves we're doing some backcountry camping, clear our heads after everything that's happened." I nodded slowly, already feeling a mix of anticipation and dread building in my chest. "Okay, but we need to be prepared. This isn't like our usual patrols," Laura agreed, and we spent the next hour planning our expedition. We would pack enough supplies for 3 days just in case. Heavy-duty camping gear, extra batteries for our flashlights, and emergency flares were all added to our list. I also decided to bring my personal hunting rifle, something I rarely carried on regular park duty. As we left the diner, the cool night air filled with the chirping of crickets. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to cross a line. This was no longer just an investigation. It felt like we were gearing up for a confrontation. The days leading up to our expedition passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. When Saturday morning finally arrived, Laura and I met at a remote trailhead, our packs loaded and our nerves on edge. "Ready for this?" Laura asked as we did one final gear check. I took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of trees before us. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, its depths hiding untold secrets. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied. We set off down the overgrown trail, the sounds of civilization quickly fading behind us. The path was rough, barely visible in some places, a testament to how rarely this area was visited. As we hiked, I found myself constantly scanning our surroundings, every snapping twig or rustling leaf sending a jolt of adrenaline through my system. By mid-afternoon, we had reached the old fire road Laura had identified. It was little more than a narrow cut through the forest now, nature having reclaimed much of the land. But it was still visible enough to follow, leading us deeper into the heart of the creature's supposed territory. As we walked, the forest around us seemed to change. The trees grew older, more gnarled, their branches twisting together overhead to create a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and a light mist began to gather around our feet. "Does something feel off to you?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense of watchfulness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the forest itself was aware of our presence and was not happy about our intrusion. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, we decided to make camp for the night. We found a small clearing just off the old fire road and quickly set up our tent. As we sat around our small campfire eating a dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, neither of us spoke much. The weight of our mission and the potential dangers we faced hung heavy in the air. It was well past midnight when I was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around us, followed by a high-pitched keening that made my blood run cold. "Laura!" I hissed, reaching for my rifle. "Wake up." She was already stirring, her eyes wide in the darkness of the tent. "What was that?" "I don't know," I replied, but it was close. We listened intently, hardly daring to breathe. For several long minutes there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. Then, just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it, the sound came again, closer this time. "We need to move," I said, already starting to pack up our gear as quietly as possible. Laura nodded, her face pale in the faint moonlight that filtered through the tent fabric. We worked quickly and silently, years of ranger training kicking in despite our fear. As we emerged from the tent, the forest around us seemed alive with shadows. Every tree, every bush could have been hiding our unseen stalker. We doused our fire and shouldered our packs, moving back to the old fire road with as much stealth as we could muster. We had only gone a few hundred yards when Laura suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing ahead. There, in the middle of the overgrown road, stood a figure that made my heart stop. It was the creature we had seen that night weeks ago, but seeing it here in the pale moonlight was a whole different level of terrifying. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body a mass of matted fur and rippling muscle, but it was the face that truly chilled me to the bone. It was a twisted parody of something almost human, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a staring contest with a monster out of nightmare. Then, with a roar that shook leaves from the trees, it charged. "Run!" I yelled, shoving Laura ahead of me. We crashed through the underbrush, all attempts at stealth abandoned in our desperation to escape. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footfalls gaining ground with terrifying speed. As we ran, the forest around us seemed to come alive. Branches whipped at our faces, roots reached up to trip us. It was as if the very land was working against us, trying to deliver us into the clutches of the monster that pursued us. Ahead, I spotted a break in the trees, a steep ravine cutting across our path. Without slowing, I grabbed Laura's hand and pulled her towards it. "We have to jump." She nodded, understanding immediately. As we reached the edge, we leapt, sailing through the air for a heart-stopping moment before crashing into the thick underbrush on the other side. We tumbled down the slope, coming to a stop in a tangle of limbs and leaves. For a moment, we lay there, gasping for breath, listening for any sign of pursuit. The forest had gone eerily silent. No sign of the creature. No sound of it crashing through the underbrush after us, just the pounding of our hearts and the rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. As we slowly got to our feet, checking for injuries, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. We had escaped, yes, but we had also confirmed our worst fears. The Shannon demon was real, and it was far more terrifying than any legend could have prepared us for. What we had stumbled into was beyond anything we had been trained for, beyond anything we could have imagined. As we gathered our scattered gear and tried to get our bearings, I knew that our lives had been irrevocably changed. The tranquil forests of Shenandoah would never look the same to me again, and the horrors we had witnessed would haunt us long after this night was over. Little did we know, our ordeal was just beginning. The creature was out there watching, waiting, and it had marked us as its prey. As dawn broke, casting an eerie glow through the misty forest, Laura and I found ourselves huddled in the hollow of an ancient oak tree. Our bodies ached from the night's frantic escape, and our minds reeled from what we had witnessed. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what might come next. "We need to get back to civilization," Laura whispered, her voice hoarse. "Report what we've seen." I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. "And tell them what exactly?" "That we went off on our own to hunt a mythical creature and nearly got ourselves killed? Reeves will have our badges." Laura's eyes flashed with determination. "We have evidence now, Zeke. We both saw it clear as day. And I managed to snap a few photos before we ran." My eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You got pictures? When?" "Just before it charged," she replied, pulling out her camera with shaking hands. "I don't know how good they are, but it's something." We huddled over the camera's small screen, flicking through the images. Most were blurry, the result of panicked hands and poor lighting. But one stood out. It wasn't perfectly clear, but there was no mistaking the towering figure, its eyes reflecting the camera flash in an unnatural, piercing glow. "This changes everything," I breathed, a mixture of excitement and fear coursing through me. As we made our way back towards the ranger station, exhausted and on edge, we discussed our next steps. We knew we had to report our findings, but we also knew that without more concrete evidence, we might not be believed. Upon our return, we were immediately summoned to Reeves's office. His face was a mask of anger and concern as we recounted our unauthorized expedition and showed him the photographic evidence. "I ought to fire both of you on the spot," he growled, but there was a hint of fear in his eyes as he studied the photos. "But given what you've brought back, we need to handle this carefully." Over the next few weeks, a covert operation was put into place. Wildlife experts, cryptozoologists, and even a few government agents descended on Shenandoah National Park. The official story was that of a routine wildlife survey, but those of us who knew the truth could feel the tension in the air. It was on a cold November evening when everything came to a head. Laura and I were part of a team doing a night patrol in the creature's territory when our radios crackled to life. "All units, we have a visual. Sector 7. Approach with extreme caution." My heart raced as we converged on the location, and there it was, illuminated by our flashlights. The Shannon demon in all its terrifying glory. It roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath our feet, and charged. What followed was chaos. Gunshots rang out, flashlights bobbed wildly in the darkness, and shouts of terror and pain filled the air. In the midst of it all, I found myself face to face with the creature. Its eyes filled with an ancient alien intelligence bore into mine. In that moment, I understood that this was no mere animal, but something far more complex and terrifying. The battle in the forest that night changed everything. The creature was eventually brought down, but not before it had claimed several lives. The aftermath was a whirlwind of government cover-ups, scientific studies, and heated debates about the nature of the creature and its origins. Laura and I were hailed as heroes by some and reckless fools by others. But as the dust settled and life in Shenandoah National Park slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, we found ourselves forever changed by our encounter with the unknown. Years have passed since that fateful night, and I still serve as a ranger in Shenandoah, but now as I patrol the quiet trails and serene vistas, I carry with me the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than most people realize. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow at dusk, reminds me of the thin veil that separates the world we know from the one we don't. To this day, rumors persist of other creatures lurking in the deep woods of Shenandoah, and sometimes on quiet nights when the mist rolls in and the moon is high, I swear I can hear a distant, otherworldly howl echoing through the ancient hills. It serves as a reminder that there are some mysteries that can never truly be solved, some secrets that the forest will always keep. As I stand at the overlook, watching the sun set over the rolling hills of Shenandoah, I can't help but wonder, what other secrets lie hidden in the heart of these ancient forests? And are we truly ready to face them? Black Mountain Wilderness isn't a place you'd find on most maps. It's a harsh, unforgiving stretch of land tucked away in the Mojave Desert. All rock formations and empty dry land that feels like the bones of the earth. My name's Garrett Boyd, and in 1996, at the age of 28, I found myself working the graveyard shift in this godforsaken place. I'm not a big-shot ranger. I've been doing this job for 5 years now, ever since I figured out college wasn't for me. The wilderness suits me more than fluorescent lights and office cubicles, that's for damn sure. But on nights like that one, I started to wonder if I made the right choice. Black Mountain doesn't draw the tourists like Yosemite or the Grand Canyon. In a way, I prefer it that way, keeps the weirdos out. Well, except me, I guess. But there's something about this place that gets under your skin. A feeling of ancient secrets buried beneath the sand and rock. The day everything changed started like any other. I arrived at the ranger station just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The air was still warm from the day's heat, but I knew it wouldn't last. Desert nights can be cold as hell, and I had my jacket ready. As I checked in, my supervisor, a grizzled old-timer named Frank, gave me my assignment for the night. Garrett, I need you to check out the southern sector near that old mining site. We've had some reports of unusual activity out there. I raised an eyebrow. Unusual how? Frank shrugged. Probably just some kids messing around, but we need to check it out. You know how it is? I did know. In a place like Black Mountain, unusual activity could mean anything from illegal campers to drug runners. But something in Frank's tone made me uneasy. He wasn't telling me everything. As I headed out in my truck, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, plunging the desert into darkness. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the twisted shapes of Joshua trees and the occasional startled jackrabbit. The southern sector was one of the most remote areas of the park. The old mining site, abandoned in the 1940s long before I was born, was particularly difficult to reach. The trailhead was washed out and the only way to get there was on foot. I parked my truck behind a ridge out of sight from the main trail. As I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, and sidearm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The desert was too quiet, the stillness unnatural. Little did I know as I set off towards the mining site that this night would change everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. The secrets of Black Mountain Wilderness were about to reveal themselves, and I was woefully unprepared for what awaited me in the darkness. The moon hung low in the sky as I made my way towards the old mining site, its pale light doing little to illuminate the rugged terrain. The air was cold now and I had my jacket zipped up tight. But it wasn't just the temperature that sent a chill down my spine. There was something off about the night. Now, the thing about working in a desert wilderness is you get used to weird sounds. Coyotes, snakes, hell, even the occasional feral dog. But this was different. I first heard it when I crossed over a ridge, the sound of something heavy moving across the dry brush. At first, I chalked it up to the wind. It's amazing how the desert can trick you, but I know better than to trust my ears out here. Still, the sound didn't stop. It dragged like someone was pulling a body through the dirt. I took out my flashlight, scanning the area, but all I could see were the shadows of Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching up like skeletons clawing for the sky. The light didn't reach far. It never does in the desert. It's like the darkness eats it up. And that's when I smelled it. Not the usual scent of sagebrush or dry earth, but something rotten, metallic. Like copper mixed with decay. I turned to head back to my truck, figuring maybe it was an old coyote carcass rotting nearby. But then I heard the dragging again. This time it was closer. Too close. I was standing there with a flashlight in one hand and my radio in the other, listening. A shuffling sound, almost human, but off. I couldn't tell if it was coming from my left or right, so I just stood there like an idiot, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. Then I heard a crack. Not a branch, there's not enough trees for that. But something solid snapping. I swung my flashlight around, the beam slicing through the dark. That's when I saw it, a figure hunched over, dragging something bulky behind it. I froze. My first thought was that it was some vagrant, maybe a drifter who had gotten lost out here. But as the light hit its back, I realized how wrong I was. This thing, whatever it was massive. Covered in coarse fur that stuck to its body in clumps like it hadn't bathed in weeks, maybe months. Its arms were long, too long, dragging some poor creature along the ground. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Its legs bent the wrong way, backward like a bird, and they were thick, muscular, built for running. This thing wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't human. I tried to move, but I felt rooted to the spot. My brain was screaming at me to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It didn't make any noise. No growls, no hisses. Just the sound of its feet dragging along the dirt as it slowly shifted the weight of whatever it was pulling. I finally snapped out of my shock and stumbled back, trying to grab my radio to call for backup, but my hand was shaking too much to get a grip on it. The thing turned its head in my direction. I didn't get a good look at its face, but I saw enough to know I never wanted to. It had something in its mouth. Something red and stringy. I gagged. The creature turned its attention back to its task and started dragging its kill again. I don't know if it even noticed me or just didn't care. My feet finally found the courage to move, and I bolted back toward the ridge, sliding down loose rocks and kicking up dirt. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, heart pounding so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. I didn't stop until I saw the faint outline of my truck in the distance. Headlights off, hidden behind the ridgeline. I dove into the cab, slamming the door shut behind me. My fingers fumbled to get the keys into the ignition. For a few agonizing seconds, the engine wouldn't start, the truck sputtering like it wanted to die right there with me in it. I cursed under my breath, and just as I was about to lose it, the engine roared to life. I didn't wait to see if the thing followed me. I tore out of there like my life depended on it, which at that moment it probably did. Frank sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Garrett, I've been working these parks for over 30 years. The desert, it does things to your mind, makes you see things that aren't there. Trust me, it's better to just forget about it and move on. But I couldn't forget, and I couldn't move on. The image of that creature was burned into my mind, and I knew I wouldn't rest until I understood what was really going on in this godforsaken place. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice subtle changes in the park. Wildlife seemed scarcer, the nights quieter. It was as if the very land was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, one night, about a month after my encounter, I got my chance to dig deeper. I was assigned to patrol the eastern sector, an area not far from where I had first seen the creature. As I drove out into the darkness, my heart raced with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The eastern sector was even more desolate than the southern one. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the earth like the bones of some ancient, long-dead giant. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the landscape, turning familiar shapes into monstrous silhouettes. I parked my truck and set out on foot, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Every sound, every movement in the shadows set my nerves on edge, but I pressed on, determined to find some answers. After about an hour of hiking, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. There, in a small clearing, was a circle of stones. But these weren't just any stones. They were arranged in a precise pattern, with strange symbols carved into their surfaces. As I approached, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air around the stone circle felt different, charged somehow like the moment before a lightning strike. I knelt down to examine one of the stones more closely, running my fingers over the strange symbols. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the landscape. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, but when I blinked, it was gone. Heart pounding, I realized I had stayed out here too long. Whatever this stone circle was, whatever it meant, I knew I was in over my head. I needed help. Someone who could make sense of what I had found. As I made my way back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and more than once I caught glimpses of something just at the edge of my vision. By the time I reached my vehicle, I was in a cold sweat. As I drove back to the ranger station, my mind raced with possibilities. What was that stone circle? Who had built it? And most importantly, what was its connection to the creature I had seen? I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. It was time to bring someone else in on the secret. But who could I trust? Who would believe me? As I pulled into the station parking lot, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would reach out to Dr. Eleanor Vance, a professor of anthropology at the nearby university. I had met her once at a park event, and I remembered her mentioning an interest in Native American artifacts. If anyone could help me make sense of what I had found, it was her. But little did I know, by bringing Dr. Vance into this, I was about to set in motion a chain of events that would lead us both into the heart of a mystery far darker and more ancient than either of us could have imagined. The secrets of Black Mountain Wilderness were beginning to unravel, and I was about to learn that some truths are better left buried in the desert sands. The next morning, I called Dr. Eleanor Vance's office at the university. After explaining that I had found something of potential archaeological interest in the park, she agreed to meet me that afternoon. I spent the intervening hours in a state of nervous anticipation, rehearsing how I would explain what I had seen without sounding like a complete lunatic. Dr. Vance arrived at the ranger station just after 2 p.m. She was a tall, slender woman in her early 50s, with sharp green eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. As I led her to a private meeting room, I could feel her scrutinizing gaze on me. "So, Ranger Boyd," she began as we sat down, "you mentioned on the phone that you found something unusual. Can you elaborate?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Dr. Vance, before I show you what I've found, I need to tell you about something that happened to me a few weeks ago. It's going to sound crazy, but I swear to you, every word of it is true." Over the next half hour, I recounted my encounter with the creature, as well as my discovery of the stone circle. To her credit, Dr. Vance listened without interruption, her expression remaining neutral throughout. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, she nodded slowly. "Ranger Boyd, what you've described is extraordinary, but it's not entirely without precedent." My eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Dr. Vance leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "There are stories, ancient legends from the indigenous tribes of this area, that speak of creatures not unlike what you've described. Beings that walk between our world and something else. The stone circle you found may be connected to these legends." She paused, studying my face. "I'd like to see this circle for myself. Can you take me there?" I nodded, relief washing over me. She believed me, or at least she was willing to consider the possibility that what I had seen was real. As we drove out to the eastern sector, Dr. Vance filled me in on some of the legends she had mentioned. The local tribe spoke of a time long ago when the desert was a different place, teeming with life and strange, powerful beings. But something happened, a great cataclysm that changed the land and drove these beings into hiding. According to the legends, Dr. Vance explained, there are still places where the veil between worlds is thin, places where these beings can cross over, if the conditions are right. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the unnatural stillness of the night I had encountered the creature. "And you think Black Mountain might be one of these places?" Dr. Vance nodded grimly. "It's possible. The geology of this area is unique. There are magnetic anomalies, unexplained energy readings. It's the kind of place where strange things tend to happen." As we neared the location of the stone circle, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The air seemed thicker somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Dr. Vance must have felt it too, because she fell silent, her eyes scanning the landscape intently. We parked the truck and set out on foot. As we approached the clearing where I had found the circle, I noticed something odd. The vegetation seemed different, more lush, almost tropical. It was as if we had stepped into a completely different ecosystem. "This isn't right," I muttered, my hand instinctively moving to the sidearm at my hip. Dr. Vance nodded, her face pale. "The legends speak of this too. Areas around the thin places, where reality itself seems to warp and change." As we entered the clearing, both of us stopped short. The stone circle was there, just as I had left it. But now in the center of the circle stood a tall, angular stone pillar that I was certain hadn't been there before. Dr. Vance approached it cautiously, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and academic excitement. "This is incredible. The markings on this pillar, they're unlike anything I've ever seen." I hung back, scanning the edges of the clearing. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. Shadows seemed to move at the corner of my vision, and I could have sworn I heard whispers on the wind. "Dr. Vance," I said, my voice tight, "I think we should go. Something's not right here." She turned to look at me, her mouth open to protest, but before she could speak, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the clearing. It was a sound I recognized all too well. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Dr. Vance's arm and pulling her towards the path back to the truck. As we fled, I risked a glance back over my shoulder. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The creature from that night weeks ago was there, emerging from behind the stone pillar, but it wasn't alone. 2 more of its kind flanked it, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. We ran faster than I thought possible, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear the creatures in pursuit, their inhuman howls echoing through the desert night. As we finally reached the truck, fumbling with the keys and practically diving inside, I realized that everything had changed. This was no longer just about me and what I had seen. We had stumbled upon something far bigger, far more dangerous than I could have imagined. As I gunned the engine and sped away from the site, Dr. Vance turned to me, her face pale and drawn. "Ranger Boyd," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we may have just opened a door that was meant to stay closed." I nodded grimly, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The secrets of Black Mountain Wilderness were beginning to reveal themselves, and I had a sinking feeling that our lives would never be the same again. The drive back to the ranger station was tense and silent. Dr. Vance sat rigid in her seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, while I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those creatures pursuing us. The adrenaline was slowly wearing off, leaving me shaky and nauseous. As we pulled into the station parking lot, I killed the engine but made no move to get out. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, both still processing what we had just experienced. Finally, Dr. Vance broke the silence. "Ranger Boyd." "Garrett," she said, her voice hoarse, "what we saw back there, it changes everything. We need to approach this carefully." I nodded, running a hand through my hair. "I know, but what do we do? Who do we tell?" She shook her head. "For now, no one. We need more information before we go public with this. If we start talking about interdimensional creatures and mystical stone circles, we'll be laughed out of our careers." I couldn't argue with that logic, but the thought of keeping quiet didn't sit well with me. But what about the danger? Those things are out there, and they're not just wildlife. They're intelligent, and they're hunting. Dr. Vance's expression was grim. "I know, but we need proof. Hard evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away, and we need to understand what we're dealing with." Over the next few weeks, Dr. Vance and I met regularly, poring over ancient texts, local legends, and scientific papers on the geological oddities of the Black Mountain area. We were building a case piece by piece, but it felt like for every question we answered, 2 more took its place. Meanwhile, strange occurrences in the park were becoming more frequent. Hikers reported odd noises and unexplained lights. Wildlife behaved erratically, and the atmosphere of the place seemed to change, becoming heavier, more oppressive. One night, about a month after our encounter at the Stone Circle, I was on a routine patrol when my radio crackled to life. "Garrett, you there?" It was Frank, and he sounded worried. "I'm here, Frank. What's up?" "We've got a situation. A group of campers just called in. They say something's stalking their campsite." "Sounds big." My heart rate spiked. "Where?" "Sector 7 near Coyote Ridge. I'm heading out there now, but I could use backup." I swallowed hard. Sector 7 was close to where I'd first seen the creature. "I'm on my way, Frank. Be careful." As I sped towards Coyote Ridge, I debated calling Dr. Vance, but what could she do? This was happening now, and I didn't have time to wait for backup that might not believe what they were seeing. When I arrived at the campsite, Frank's truck was already there, but there was no sign of him or the campers. The tents were still up, but they had been shredded, their contents strewn about. The campfire was nothing but smoldering embers. "Frank," I called out, my voice echoing in the eerie silence. "Frank, where are you?" That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the shadows beyond the campsite. I swung my flashlight in that direction and froze. There, at the edge of the light, stood one of the creatures. But this one was different. It was larger, its fur matted with what looked horribly like fresh blood, and in its elongated clawed hand it held Frank's ranger's hat. For a moment we stared at each other, neither moving. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it charged. I barely had time to draw my sidearm before it was upon me. I fired, the sound deafening in the quiet desert night. The creature stumbled but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar of pain and rage that shook me to my core. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls gaining ground. I zigzagged between boulders and Joshua trees, trying to break its line of sight. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a steep incline, rocks and thorny brush tearing at my clothes and skin. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a narrow ravine hidden from view. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. Above, I could hear the creature moving about, searching. Its frustrated growls echoed off the canyon walls. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sounds faded into the distance. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, I climbed out of the ravine, battered and bruised, but alive. The campsite was deserted, with no sign of Frank, the campers, or the creature. I knew then that I couldn't keep this quiet any longer. Whatever was happening in Black Mountain Wilderness, it was escalating. People were missing, possibly dead, and I was in way over my head. As I drove back to the ranger station, my mind raced. It was time to bring in outside help, consequences be damned. But little did I know, the true horror of what we were facing was only just beginning to reveal itself. The secrets of Black Mountain were unraveling, and the price of knowledge was about to become terrifyingly clear. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. As soon as I got back to the ranger station, I called Dr. Vance and filled her in on what had happened. She agreed it was time to go public with what we knew. We contacted the local authorities, the FBI, and even reached out to a few trusted journalists. At first, we were met with skepticism and disbelief. But as more people went missing and strange sightings increased, the tide began to turn. A task force was assembled, combining local law enforcement, federal agents, and scientific experts. Dr. Vance and I found ourselves at the center of it all, trying to explain the unexplainable. The park was closed to the public, and a perimeter was established around the area where we had encountered the creatures. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and teams of armed personnel combed the desert. It was surreal, watching the quiet wilderness I had come to know transform into a militarized zone. 5 days after the incident at the campsite, we made our first major breakthrough. A team exploring a series of caves near the Stone Circle discovered what appeared to be an underground complex of tunnels and chambers. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols we had seen on the stones, and there were signs of recent activity. As we delved deeper into the complex, the air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Dr. Vance, who was part of the exploration team, looked pale and shaken. "This place," she whispered to me as we moved through a particularly narrow passage. "It's not natural. The geology, the atmosphere. It's as if reality itself is warped here." I nodded grimly, my hand tightening on my rifle. We had been issued military-grade weapons after the encounter at the campsite, but in the face of what we were dealing with, they felt woefully inadequate. As we emerged into a large, circular chamber, everyone stopped short. In the center of the room stood a structure that defied description. It was like a pillar of swirling energy, pulsing with colors that hurt to look at directly. Around its base were more of the creatures we had encountered, but they were different, more human-like in appearance, yet still undeniably alien. They turned to face us as we entered, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly intelligence. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the creatures stepped forward and, to our shock, spoke. "You have come," it said, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to echo in our minds rather than our ears. "The cycle nears its end. The merging begins." Before anyone could respond, the pillar of energy pulsed violently. The air crackled with electricity, and I felt a sensation like the world was being torn apart around us. The creatures began to chant in a language that hurt to hear, their forms shifting and changing as the energy from the pillar washed over them. "Fall back," I yelled, grabbing Dr. Vance and pulling her towards the exit. But it was too late. The pillar exploded in a blinding flash of light, and I felt myself being thrown backwards. As I lost consciousness, my last thought was that we had stumbled upon something far beyond our understanding, and that the consequences of our discovery might be more terrible than we could have ever imagined. When I came to, I was lying on the desert floor outside the cave entrance. The sky above was a swirling mass of unnatural colors, and the air felt thick and strange. As I struggled to my feet, I saw that the landscape had changed. Bizarre alien vegetation had sprouted from the once barren ground, and in the distance I could see structures that defied the laws of physics. Dr. Vance was nearby, helping others to their feet. Her face was a mask of shock and awe, Garrett, she said as I approached, I think we've triggered some kind of interdimensional event. The barrier between our world and whatever is on the other side, it's breaking down. As if to punctuate her words, a massive, otherworldly creature soared overhead, its multiple wings casting strange shadows on the transformed landscape below. I realized then that we were no longer dealing with just a local phenomenon. The secrets of Black Mountain had been unleashed, and the world as we knew it would never be the same. We had opened a door that was never meant to be opened, and now we had to face the consequences of our actions. As more alien creatures began to emerge from the cave and strange energies coursed through the air around us, I knew that the real battle was just beginning. The fate of our world hung in the balance, and we were the ones who had tipped the scales. The horrors of Black Mountain Wilderness had been revealed, and now they were spilling out into the world beyond. Whatever happened next, I knew that my life and the lives of everyone on Earth had been irrevocably changed by the secrets we had unearthed in this forgotten corner of the desert. The days that followed the incident at the cave were a blur of chaos and confusion. The phenomenon that had begun in Black Mountain Wilderness spread rapidly, transforming the landscape and altering the very fabric of reality around us. The military quarantined a vast area, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. Reports flooded in from around the globe of similar occurrences. Strange creatures appearing in city streets, bizarre plant life sprouting in suburban backyards, and inexplicable weather patterns that defied all known meteorological models. The world was changing, and humanity was struggling to adapt. Dr. Vance and I found ourselves at the forefront of efforts to understand and contain what was happening. We worked tirelessly with scientists, military personnel, and even mystics and occultists, trying to make sense of the new reality we had inadvertently unleashed. It's like the walls between dimensions are crumbling, Dr. Vance explained during one particularly tense briefing with government officials. What we're seeing is a merging of our world with something else, something ancient and utterly alien to our understanding. I watched the faces of the men and women around the table, seeing the fear and disbelief in their eyes. They were leaders, decision-makers, people used to being in control, but in the face of this, they were as lost as the rest of us. As the weeks turned into months, a new normal began to emerge. People adapted, as they always do. Communities formed around the changed areas, studying the new flora and fauna, learning to navigate the altered landscapes. Some even began to develop abilities, psychic powers, physical transformations, as if the human body and mind were evolving to match our new environment. But it wasn't all peaceful coexistence. Conflicts arose between those who embraced the changes and those who fought against them. Religious groups declared it the end times, while others saw it as a new beginning for humanity. Governments struggled to maintain order in a world where the laws of physics could no longer be relied upon. Through it all, I continued my work in what was left of Black Mountain Wilderness. The park, now at the epicenter of the change, had become a focal point for research and exploration. Each day brought new discoveries, new horrors and new wonders. One evening, about a year after that fateful night in the cave, I stood at the edge of what we now called the merger zone, the area where the boundaries between our world and the other were at their thinnest. The sky above swirled with impossible colors, and creatures that defied description soared through the air. Dr. Vance joined me, her once dark hair now streaked with white from the stress of the past year. "Quite a view, isn't it?" she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of awe and sadness. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the tumult of emotions inside me. Guilt, wonder, fear, and a strange sort of excitement all warred for dominance. "Do you ever wonder," I asked after a long moment, "if we did the right thing? Bringing this to light?" Dr. Vance was quiet for a time, her eyes fixed on the horizon where our world blended seamlessly into the alien landscape beyond. "I don't think we had a choice, Garrett," she said finally. "This was coming, whether we uncovered it or not. At least this way. We had some warning, some chance to prepare." I knew she was right, but it didn't ease the weight of responsibility I felt. My actions, my curiosity, had played a part in changing the world forever. For better or worse, the human race was on a new path, one that led into unknown territory. As we stood there, watching the sun set in a sky that no longer looked familiar, I realized that our journey was far from over. The secrets of Black Mountain had been revealed, but they had only opened the door to greater mysteries. What lay ahead for humanity was uncertain, filled with both peril and possibility. The quiet, forgotten wilderness I had once patrolled was gone, replaced by a frontier that stretched beyond the limits of our understanding. And as I looked out over this new world, I knew that despite the dangers, despite the fear, I would continue to explore, to seek answers, and to face whatever new horrors and wonders awaited us in this transformed reality. The end of one story had become the beginning of another, vaster and stranger than anything I could have imagined. And somewhere out there in the depths of the merger zone, I knew that the creatures that had started it all were waiting, watching, perhaps preparing for the next phase of a plan beyond human comprehension. Whatever the future held, one thing was certain: the world would never be the same, and the adventures and horrors were only just beginning. The radio crackled to life at 4:47 a.m., pulling me from a dream about my grandmother's hands weaving river cane into baskets. Her fingers moved in patterns passed down through 7 generations of our family, the same bloodline that traced back to the ancient towns along the Tuckasegee. I reached for the handset in the darkness of my ranger station, my mind still half tangled in the dream. "Wahali, you there?" It was dispatch. Janet's voice carried that particular tension that meant someone was already in trouble. "I'm here." I sat up, pulling on my boots. Outside, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park stretched out in absolute darkness, 500,000 acres of old-growth forest where cell signals died and people disappeared with disturbing regularity. "We've got a situation. Family of 3, the Hendersons from Michigan. Didn't check in at their campsite last night. They were supposed to be at Buckhorn Creek, but we've got nothing. Last ping on their emergency beacon was near Cataloochee Valley around 11 p.m., then it went dead. I was already moving, grabbing my pack from its hook. That's 8 miles from their registered site." "I know." Janet paused. "Wahali, there's something else. A hiker came into the visitor center about an hour ago. Solo backpacker, pretty shaken up. Said he heard something following him near Midnight Hole last night. Something big." My hand stilled on my flashlight. "Did he see it?" "No. But he said the woods went completely silent before it started. You know what that means." I did. My grandfather had taught me what it meant when the forest stopped making noise, when the insects ceased their chirping and the owls stopped calling, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It meant something had entered the woods that didn't belong there, something the forest itself feared. "I'm heading out now," I said. "Have you contacted?" "Search and rescue is mobilizing, but they won't be ready to deploy until first light. You're our closest responder. I'm sending you the last known coordinates now." The GPS coordinates appeared on my phone screen: 35.6644 C, NEN, 83.0890. W. Deep in the backcountry, nowhere near any established trail. My stomach tightened. I loaded my pack with essentials: water filtration system, first aid kit, emergency blanket, rope, flares, and my grandfather's hunting knife. The blade was old, the handle wrapped in leather that had molded to my hand over the years. Before he died, he'd told me stories about the Nun-You-Know-Why, the Stone Man, and other beings that walked the old mountains. I dismissed them as folklore, the kind of stories elders tell to keep children from wandering too far from camp. That was before I became a ranger. Before I started finding things in these woods that had no explanation. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes on roads that twisted through the darkness like black ribbons. My headlights caught the reflective eyes of deer watching from the tree line, but nothing else moved. I parked at the Cataloochee access point and shouldered my pack, checking my radio one more time. "I'm at the trailhead," I reported, starting the hike in. "Be careful, Wahali, and keep your radio on." I clicked off and started into the forest. My flashlight beam cut through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating the narrow trail ahead. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, that rich forest smell that I normally loved. But this morning it seemed heavier somehow, oppressive. I'd been walking for 20 minutes when I found the first sign. The footprint was pressed deep into the mud beside the trail, far too large to be human. I knelt down, measuring it with my hand. 18 inches long, maybe 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds. My pulse quickened. In my 5 years as a ranger, I'd seen bear tracks, elk tracks, wild boar tracks. This was none of those. The toe arrangement was wrong, too human-like, and the stride length between this print and the next one I found 15 feet ahead suggested something that walked upright. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone who worked in these mountains had. Hikers who claimed to see massive hair-covered figures moving between the trees. Campers who found their food supplies torn apart by something with incredible strength. Rangers who'd investigated strange howls that echoed through the valleys at night, sounds that weren't quite animal, but weren't quite human either. The official position was always the same: misidentification, overactive imagination, the usual suspects. But standing there in the darkness looking at that impossible footprint, I remembered something my grandfather had said during one of his stories. The Sulkaloo, he'd called it. The slant-eyed giant. An ancient being from Cherokee folklore said to haunt the deep woods and steal hunters who ventured too far from their villages. He'd spoken about it matter-of-factly, the way other people talked about bears or coyotes. Just another part of the forest ecosystem, something to be respected and avoided. I took photographs of the print with my phone, though I knew the quality would be poor in the flashlight's harsh beam. Then I kept moving, following the Henderson family's last known trajectory. The forest around me remained unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my own breathing and the soft crunch of my boots on the trail. I'd been in plenty of quiet woods before. Winter mornings, the deep stillness after a snowfall. This was different. This silence felt watchful. At 6:15 a.m., just as the first gray light began filtering through the canopy, I found the campsite, or what was left of it. The tent had been shredded, long tears in the fabric that suggested massive claws or hands. Sleeping bags lay scattered across the clearing, their contents spilled into the dirt. A Coleman stove was crushed flat, as if something heavy had stepped on it, and everywhere on the tent poles, on the scattered gear, on the trees surrounding the campsite, I saw the same thing. Handprints. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own hand, pressed into the fabric and bark in what looked like dried mud. But as I examined them more closely with my flashlight, I realized the substance wasn't mud. It was darker, stickier. I touched it carefully with a gloved finger and brought it to my nose. Blood, old blood, already oxidized and darkening. Jesus, I breathed. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, this is Wohali. I found the Henderson campsite. It's bad. The tent is destroyed. Gear everywhere. No sign of the family, but there's blood. A lot of blood. Static crackled for a moment before Janet's voice came through. Are you seeing any bodies? Negative. No bodies. But there are tracks everywhere. Large tracks. I'm going to follow them. Wohali, wait for backup. Search and rescue is en route. These tracks are fresh. If the family is still alive, we might not have time to wait. I didn't wait for permission. The tracks led away from the campsite in a clear trail. The massive footprints pressed deep into the forest floor. Whatever had made them was heavy, powerful and moving with purpose. The trail wound deeper into the backcountry, away from any established paths. I followed for nearly an hour, watching the sun rise slowly over the mountains and paint the forest in shades of gold and green. The beauty of it was marred by what I was tracking, something that had attacked a family's campsite and dragged them into the wilderness. At 7:30 a.m., I heard it for the first time, a vocalization that echoed through the valley. Not a roar, not a scream, but something in between. It had a distinctly primate quality to it, a throaty whoop that rose and fell in pitch. The sound froze me in place, every hair on my body standing on end. It came from somewhere ahead, maybe a quarter-mile away. I checked my rifle, making sure a round was chambered. My grandfather's knife felt reassuring on my belt. Then I started moving again, more carefully now, trying to minimize the sound of my footsteps on the leaf litter. The tracks led me to a ravine, a deep cut in the landscape where water had carved away the rock over millennia. The bottom was thick with vegetation and fallen logs, creating natural hiding places. As I descended carefully down the slope, I saw something that made my breath catch. A shoe, small, child-sized, lying on its side near a fallen oak. I picked it up carefully. It was a pink sneaker, size 13, with cartoon characters on the side. Inside, I could see the name written in marker on the insole, Emma Henderson. They'd had a daughter. The briefing hadn't mentioned a child. Dispatch, I said quietly into my radio. I've found evidence of a juvenile. The family has a child with them. Copy that. Search and rescue is 15 minutes out from your last known position. They're requesting you hold and wait for... The radio cut off mid-sentence, replaced by harsh static. I tried adjusting the frequency, but nothing came through except white noise. I looked at my phone. No signal, which was normal this deep in the backcountry. I was on my own. The vocalization came again, closer this time, and I realized something that sent a chill through my core. It sounded almost like it was answering something, like there was more than one of these creatures calling to each other through the forest. I kept Emma Henderson's shoe in my pocket and continued following the tracks. The ravine bottom grew darker as the walls rose higher on either side, blocking out the morning sun. Water trickled somewhere nearby, and the air smelled of wet stone and moss. That's when I saw the cave. It was a dark mouth in the ravine wall, partially hidden by hanging vines and fallen rocks. The tracks led directly to it, the massive footprints pressed into the mud at the entrance. From inside, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Crying. Soft, muffled sobbing. Someone was alive in there. I approached the cave entrance with my rifle raised, flashlight mounted underneath the barrel. Every instinct screamed at me to wait for backup, to follow protocol, to radio for assistance. But my radio was dead, and that crying from inside the cave was getting weaker. The entrance was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, large enough that whatever had made those tracks could enter without having to crouch. Scratch marks covered the rock walls on either side, deep gouges that looked fresh. I touched one carefully, and felt the roughness of recently disturbed stone. "Hello," I called out. "This is Park Ranger Wohali. If anyone can hear me, I'm here to help." The crying stopped abruptly. For a moment there was only silence. Then a voice, small and terrified. "Help us, please." A child's voice. "Emma." "I'm coming in," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "Are you hurt? Is your family with you?" "Mom's bleeding. Dad's not moving anymore." My throat tightened. I checked my pack one more time. First aid kit, water, emergency blanket. Then I entered the cave. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, the walls closing in until I had to turn sideways in places. My flashlight beam revealed ancient limestone formations, stalactites hanging from the ceiling like stone teeth. The air grew colder as I descended, carrying a smell that made my stomach turn, a mixture of decay, musk, and something else I couldn't identify. After about 40 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight swept across the space, revealing a nightmare. The cave was roughly 30 feet across, the ceiling lost in darkness above. The floor was covered in bones. Deer, elk, wild boar, and others I couldn't immediately identify. Some were fresh enough that scraps of flesh still clung to them. Others had been here so long they'd turned brown and brittle. And there, huddled against the far wall, were the Hendersons. The mother, Sarah Henderson, sat with her back against the rock, one arm wrapped around a small girl with tangled blonde hair. The other arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Blood soaked through her jacket from multiple lacerations across her shoulders and back. The girl, Emma, I assumed, was crying silently now, her face buried in her mother's chest. A few feet away lay a man's body. David Henderson. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. He'd been dead for hours. "I'm Ranger Wohali," I said softly, holstering my rifle and pulling out my first aid kit. "I'm going to get you out of here." Sarah's eyes focused on me with desperate hope. "There were 2 of them," she whispered. "They came at night. We heard something outside the tent, and David went to check." She broke down, unable to continue. I crossed the chamber quickly, kneeling beside her to assess her injuries. The broken arm was bad but not life-threatening. The lacerations on her back were worse, deep tears that needed immediate attention to prevent shock from blood loss. "Where are they now?" I asked, opening my kit and pulling out gauze and antiseptic. "They left, maybe an hour ago." I heard them calling to each other, then they went out. I worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging her wounds as best I could in the dim light. Emma watched with huge traumatized eyes, occasionally glancing toward the cave entrance as if expecting the creatures to return. "Can you walk?" I asked Sarah. She nodded, though her face was pale from blood loss. "I think so. But David, I know I'm sorry, but we have to move now, while those things are gone." I helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight with one arm. Emma clung to my other hand, her grip painfully tight. We started toward the tunnel entrance, moving as quickly as Sarah's injuries would allow. We'd made it maybe 10 feet when I heard it. A sound from deeper in the cave, from a passage I hadn't noticed in my initial survey. Heavy footsteps, accompanied by that same strange whooping vocalization. "Run," I said quietly. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. Despite her injuries, she stumbled toward the exit with Emma, moving on pure adrenaline. I stayed behind, drawing my rifle and aiming at the dark passage. The creature that emerged into my flashlight beam exceeded every description I'd ever heard. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that was matted with dirt and something else, gore from its recent kills. The face was oddly human-like, with a flat nose and deep-set eyes that caught my flashlight and reflected with an amber glow. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, suggesting immense strength, and its arms hung past its knees, ending in hands the size of dinner plates. But what froze me wasn't its size or appearance. It was the intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't a simple animal. This thing was thinking, calculating, studying me with an awareness that seemed almost human. For a moment we simply stared at each other. My finger rested on the trigger, but I didn't fire. Some instinct. Maybe something passed down through my grandfather's stories told me that shooting would be a mistake, that this creature wasn't just another animal to be driven off with violence. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A roar that seemed to vibrate through my chest, so loud in the enclosed space that I felt my teeth rattle. The smell hit me like a physical force, rotting meat and primal musk. I fired a warning shot over its head, the crack of the rifle deafening in the cave. The creature flinched back, and I seized the opportunity to run. Sarah and Emma were already in the tunnel, scrambling up the slope toward daylight. I followed, my pack bouncing against my back, the sound of pursuit echoing behind me. The creature was coming, moving through the narrow passage with surprising speed despite its size. We burst out of the cave entrance into the morning sunlight. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled them both toward the ravine slope. Climb. Don't look back. The three of us scrambled up the rocky incline, Sarah gasping in pain with every movement. I could hear the creature behind us, emerging from the cave with a frustrated bellow. I turned and fired 2 more shots in its direction, not trying to hit it but hoping to drive it back. The shots echoed through the ravine, and for a moment, everything went still. Then from somewhere in the forest above us, I heard an answering call, that same whooping vocalization. There were more of them out there. Keep moving, I urged, helping Sarah up the last few feet to level ground. We were back at the ravine's edge, the forest spreading out around us in all directions. I pulled out my GPS, trying to orient myself and find the fastest route back to the main trail. That's when I realized we were being herded. The creature from the cave hadn't followed us up the slope. Instead, I caught glimpses of it moving parallel to us through the trees, staying just out of clear sight. And somewhere ahead I could hear others moving through the brush, their heavy footsteps creating a loose perimeter. They were working together, coordinating, driving us in a specific direction. I changed course, pulling Sarah and Emma toward a dense thicket that would be difficult for the larger creatures to navigate. But as soon as we shifted direction, I heard movement adjusting to compensate. They anticipated the move. What are they? Sarah gasped, struggling to keep up. I don't know, I admitted, but they're intelligent, too intelligent. We pushed through the thicket, branches scraping at our clothes and skin. Emma was crying again, but she kept moving, her small legs pumping as fast as they could. I kept my rifle ready, sweeping the forest around us for any sign of attack. The trees opened up ahead, revealing a small clearing with a rocky outcropping at its center. It wasn't ideal, but it was defensible. We'd have visibility in all directions and our backs protected by stone. There, I said, pointing. We'll make our stand there. We'd just reached the outcropping when my radio suddenly crackled back to life. Janet's voice came through, broken and distorted. Holly, respond. Search and rescue is your position. Can you, Janet? We're in the eastern backcountry. Coordinates. I checked my GPS and rattled off the numbers. 3 survivors, 1 casualty. We're being pursued by... The radio cut out again, dissolving into static. I positioned Sarah and Emma behind the largest rocks, creating a makeshift shelter. Then I took up a defensive position, rifle braced against the stone, scanning the tree line. They were out there. I could feel them watching, circling, waiting for something. The forest had gone completely silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. Why aren't they attacking? Sarah whispered. That was the question that terrified me most. Because if these creatures were smart enough to coordinate their movements, to herd us like prey, then they were smart enough to have a plan. And we were playing right into it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, heating the rocks we hid behind. My mouth was dry, my hands slick with sweat on the rifle stock. Emma had stopped crying, but her breathing was shallow and rapid. Early signs of shock. Then I saw it. Movement at the tree line, 50 yards away. One of the creatures stepped partially into view, its massive form unmistakable even in the dappled forest light. It stood there, watching us, making no move to attack or retreat. A second one appeared to our left, then a third to our right. We were surrounded. The creatures stood at the edge of the clearing like silent sentinels, their eyes fixed on our position, 3 of them that I could see, though I suspected there were more hidden in the forest. The largest, the one from the cave, stood directly ahead, its massive chest rising and falling with each breath. I kept my rifle aimed at the big one, my finger resting lightly on the trigger, but something held me back from firing. Maybe it was the memory of my grandfather's stories, the old laws he'd spoken about regarding the creatures of the deep forest. Maybe it was the intelligence I saw in those eyes, a recognition that killing one might doom us all. Well, Holly. Sarah's voice was weak. What do we do? Before I could answer, the large creature moved. Not toward us but to the side, revealing something I hadn't noticed before, a smaller figure, also covered in dark hair but shorter, maybe 6 feet tall, younger. The juvenile Bigfoot looked between the adult and our position, and I understood with sudden clarity what was happening. This wasn't a hunting party, this was a family unit. My mind raced back to the destroyed campsite, the violence of the attack. David Henderson must have done something when the creatures appeared, grabbed a weapon, made a threatening gesture, and the adults had responded to protect their young, just as any parent would. We'd stumbled into their territory, set up our tent near their den. The Hendersons hadn't known, couldn't have known, but ignorance didn't matter to creatures defending their home. I slowly lowered my rifle, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. Sarah gasped beside me. "What are you doing? Trust me." I set the rifle on the rock but kept it within reach. Then I did something that felt insane even as I was doing it. I stood up, making myself visible and vulnerable. The creatures tensed, the big one taking a half step forward. But I held up my hands, palms out, in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. I thought about my grandfather, about the stories he'd told, about the respect his people had always shown to the forest and its inhabitants. "Tukalu," I said, using the Cherokee name. My voice sounded small in the clearing. "We mean no harm. We're leaving your territory. We won't come back." The large creature tilted its head, studying me with those unsettling amber eyes. For a long moment nothing happened. Then it made a sound. Not the aggressive roar from before, but something softer, almost questioning. I took a step forward, still with my hands raised. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab the rifle, to protect Sarah and Emma. But I forced myself to stand still, to show no fear. The creature watched me approach, its massive muscles tensing. When I was 20 feet away, it made a low rumbling sound, and I stopped. This was as close as it would allow. From my pocket I slowly pulled out Emma's shoe, the one I'd found at the ravine. I held it up, making sure the creature could see it, then carefully placed it on the ground between us. Then I backed away, returning to Sarah and Emma's position. The large creature moved forward, each step making the ground tremble slightly. It picked up the shoe with surprising delicacy, held it for a moment, then set it back down. For Machar. Its eyes met mine again, and I saw something there that looked almost like understanding. It turned and made a series of vocalizations, barks and whoops that seemed directed at the other creatures surrounding us. One by one, they melted back into the forest, their forms disappearing among the trees with barely a sound. The large one remained for a moment longer. It looked at David Henderson's body, which I'd dragged from the cave and covered with my emergency blanket. Something like regret crossed its face, or maybe I was projecting human emotions onto something fundamentally alien. Then it too vanished into the forest, leaving us alone in the clearing. The silence that followed felt different from before. The forest slowly came back to life. Birds began singing. Insects resumed their buzzing. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on us lifted. "Did that really just happen?" Sarah whispered. "I think so." My hands were shaking as I picked up my rifle. "We need to move, now, while they're giving us the chance." I helped Sarah to her feet, and Emma wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. We started walking, heading northeast toward where I hoped we'd intersect with search and rescue. I kept checking over my shoulder, but I saw no sign of pursuit. My radio crackled to life again, Janet's voice clear this time. "Wohali, we have your position. Search and rescue is inbound. ETA 10 minutes. Do you copy?" "I copy." Relief flooded through me. "We have 2 survivors, 1 KIA. The threat has dispersed, but tell the teams to approach with caution." "Copy that." "Medical is standing by." "What about the—" Later, I cut her off. "I'll explain everything later." We walked for 15 minutes before I heard the blessed sound of a helicopter overhead. It circled once, then I saw search and rescue personnel emerging from the tree line ahead, their bright orange vests visible through the forest. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical attention, debriefing, and evacuation. Sarah and Emma were airlifted to the nearest hospital. David Henderson's body was recovered and transported with solemn efficiency. I gave my report to the search and rescue coordinator, carefully editing out the more unbelievable details. But that night, back at my ranger station, I sat down and wrote everything. Every detail, every impossible moment. I didn't submit it as an official report that would have been career suicide. Instead, I locked it in my desk drawer. Another story that would never see the light of day. My phone buzzed. A text from Janet. "The Hendersons are stable. Emma is asking for you. She wants to say thank you." I stared at the message for a long moment. A little girl who'd watched her father die, who'd been dragged to a cave by creatures that shouldn't exist, who'd somehow survived. She wanted to thank me. But all I could think about was the look in that creature's eyes. The intelligence there, the calculation, the family unit protecting their territory. Their young. Were they so different from us? I opened my grandfather's journal, the one he'd given me before he died. It was filled with stories, observations, wisdom passed down through generations. I flipped to a page I'd marked years ago, reading his careful handwriting. The Solkalu are ancient, older than our oldest stories. They keep to themselves, harm no one who respects their space. But the world is getting smaller, and their territory shrinks every year. One day there will be no forest deep enough for them to hide. What happens then? What happens then? Indeed. I closed the journal and looked out my window at the dark forest beyond. Somewhere out there, a family of creatures that science said couldn't exist was settling down for the night, caring for their young, mourning their territory's violation. Tomorrow I'd have to write my official report. I'd mention a bear attack, the standard explanation. The physical evidence could support it if you didn't look too closely at the footprints, the hand marks, the coordinated nature of the assault. But I knew the truth. And I suspected I wasn't the only ranger who did. My radio crackled. All units, be advised. We have another missing hiker report. Solo male, last seen near Klingman's Dome. Disappeared approximately 2 hours ago. All available personnel are requested to... I was already reaching for my pack before the transmission finished. 2 weeks later, I sat in a cramped conference room at park headquarters staring at a map covered in red pins. Each pin represented a missing person case over the past 5 years. The pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for. Deputy Chief Martinez stood at the head of the table, his expression grim. Wahali, you're our most experienced backcountry ranger. I need your honest assessment. Are we looking at a predator problem? Around the table sat 3 other senior rangers, a representative from the National Park Service and a wildlife biologist from the University of Tennessee. They all looked at me expectantly. I thought carefully about my answer. The official story about the Henderson incident was already set. A tragic encounter with a territorial black bear, complicated by poor campsite selection and improper food storage. Sarah and Emma Henderson had corroborated this version, whether because they truly believed it or because the alternative was too frightening to acknowledge. But sitting in my desk drawer back at the station was my real account. And in my grandfather's journal were dozens of similar stories spanning decades. I think, I said slowly, that we're dealing with something that's always been here. Something that's being displaced by increased human activity in the backcountry. The biologist Dr. Reeves leaned forward. You mean bears, I assume? Because there's been a documented increase in human-bear interactions correlating with... No, I met her eyes. Not bears. The room went silent. Martinez's jaw tightened. Ranger Woody, are you seriously suggesting? I'm suggesting we need to establish exclusion zones in certain areas of the park. Deep backcountry regions that we close to public access, permanently. That's not feasible, the NPS representative said. The public has a right to be safe. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, distributing copies around the table. These are incident reports going back 30 years. Notice the pattern. They cluster in specific regions. The same regions where we consistently find evidence of unexplained large primate activity. Dr. Reeves studied the documents, her expression skeptical. Large primate activity? In North America? The indigenous peoples of this region have stories about forest giants going back centuries, I said. My own grandfather documented sightings and encounters. What if they weren't just stories? Martinez rubbed his temples. Wohali, I know you've been through a traumatic experience. The Henderson incident was... This isn't about trauma, sir. It's about pattern recognition. Look at the data objectively. The footprints we can't explain. The vocalizations that don't match any known species. The coordinated behavior suggesting intelligence beyond typical wildlife. You're describing Bigfoot, one of the other rangers said flatly. You're asking us to make policy decisions based on Bigfoot. I'm asking us to acknowledge that there are things in these mountains we don't fully understand, and that instead of dismissing them or covering them up, we should be protecting both the creatures and the people who might encounter them. Dr. Reeves set down the documents, her expression thoughtful. There have been some interesting primatology studies suggesting possible remnant populations of Gigantopithecus in remote Asian forests. If a similar species survived in the isolated mountains of North America. You can't be serious, the NPS representative said. I'm saying, Dr. Reeves continued, that science has a history of dismissing indigenous knowledge, only to later confirm it was accurate. If Native American tribes across this entire region have consistent stories about these beings, maybe we should at least investigate properly. Martinez looked around the table, gauging reactions. Even if, and this is a massive if, even if such creatures existed, how would we handle it? We can't announce to the world that Bigfoot is real. The park would be overrun with hunters and researchers within days. We don't announce it, I said. We establish the exclusion zones under the guise of endangered species habitat protection. We increase ranger patrols in buffer areas. We educate visitors about avoiding certain regions without explaining why. and we document everything properly, in case we ever do need to go public. The meeting lasted another hour, with arguments for and against various proposals. In the end, Martinez agreed to a pilot program, 3 small exclusion zones in the deepest backcountry, officially designated as critical wildlife habitat. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was a start. As the meeting broke up, Dr. Reeves approached me. "That report you mentioned, your grandfather's documentation, I'd be very interested in seeing it." I hesitated. The journal represented generations of family knowledge, passed down through a culture that had learned to coexist with these creatures. Sharing it with the scientific community felt like a betrayal of that trust. "I need to think about it," I said. She handed me her card. "I understand, but consider this. Proper scientific documentation might be the only way to ensure these creatures' long-term survival. Right now, they're cryptids, folklore. The moment they're proven to exist, they'll need protection under endangered species laws. Otherwise, they'll be hunted to extinction within a generation." She left me with that thought. That evening, I drove back to my station as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My phone rang. Sarah Henderson. "Wohali, I hope it's okay that I'm calling. The hospital gave me your number." "Of course. How are you and Emma doing?" "Better. Physically, anyway. The doctors say I'll regain full use of my arm with physical therapy. She's having nightmares. They recommended a child psychologist." "That's good. She's been through something no child should experience." A long pause. "Wohali, I need to know something. What we saw in those woods. The official report says it was a bear, but Emma keeps drawing pictures of something else. Something that walked like a man but wasn't human. I keep telling her it was just a bear, that her memory is confused by the trauma. But you know what you saw." I finished quietly. "Yes," her voice broke. "And I don't know what to do with that knowledge. How do I explain to my daughter that monsters are real, that they killed her father, that the world isn't safe the way we always told her it was?" I thought about my own childhood, listening to my grandfather's stories, how he'd taught me to respect the forest, to recognize that humans weren't the only intelligent beings on this planet, how that knowledge had shaped everything I became. "You tell her the truth," I said. "That there are things in this world we don't fully understand, that the forest has its own inhabitants who were here long before us, and that what happened to your family was a tragedy, but it wasn't evil, it was a clash between 2 different worlds. Will that help her sleep at night? Maybe not right away. But it's better than telling her comfortable lies. She deserves to understand what really happened." After we hung up, I opened my grandfather's journal again. He'd written an entry near the end, dated just a few weeks before he died. "I've spent my whole life studying the Tsilkalu, documenting their existence, trying to understand them. But I've come to realize that understanding isn't the same as control. They are what they are, ancient, intelligent, fundamentally other. The real question isn't whether they exist, but whether we can share this world with them. And I fear the answer is becoming no. Not because they're dangerous, but because we can't seem to leave any wilderness untouched, any mystery unexplored, any territory unclaimed." My radio crackled. "Wohali, you there? We've got a situation." I recognized the voice. Marcus, one of the younger rangers. "I'm here. What's going on?" "I'm at Elkmont Campground. Some hikers just came in claiming they saw something near the river. Something big and hairy that walked upright. They've got video on their phone." My stomach tightened. "Don't let them leave. I'm on my way." "I'm on my way." I grabbed my keys and headed out into the night. As I drove toward Elkmont, I thought about what Dr. Reeves had said. Maybe it was time to stop hiding the truth. Maybe documentation and scientific protection were the only way forward. Or maybe the moment we tried to study these creatures, to catalog and control them, we'd lose something essential. The mystery that had kept them safe for thousands of years would evaporate, replaced by research stations and observation blinds, and eventually, inevitably, cages. I didn't have the answer. All I knew was that I'd spent my entire adult life serving as a bridge between 2 worlds, the modern one that wanted everything explained and controlled, and the ancient one that respected mystery and maintained boundaries. When I arrived at Elkmont, I found Marcus standing with a family of 4, parents and 2 teenage kids. The father was excitedly scrolling through his phone. "Right here," he said, showing me the screen. "We got it on video, clear as day." I watched the shaky footage. In the gathering dusk, near the river's edge, a large dark figure moved between the trees. It was only visible for a few seconds before disappearing into the shadows, but the gait was unmistakable, bipedal, powerful, not quite human. "That's incredible," I said carefully. "May I ask you to do something for me?" "Sure, anything. Don't post that online, not yet." The father's expression shifted from excited to suspicious. "Why not? This is proof. This could change everything." "It could," I agreed. "But these creatures, whatever they are, They've survived by remaining hidden. The moment that video goes viral, this entire forest will be flooded with hunters, researchers, curiosity seekers. Is that really what you want? To be responsible for destroying the last refuge of an undiscovered species? The mother touched her husband's arm. He has a point, Steve. Remember what happened with those owl nests we found last year? We posted the location online, and within days, people had disturbed the site so much the birds abandoned it. The father looked at his phone, then back at me. So what are you asking? I'm asking you to think about it. Keep the video private for now. Let me share it with some researchers who might be able to help us understand what we're dealing with. And in return, I promise you'll be part of whatever comes next. The discovery of the century, but done responsibly. He thought about it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, but I want to be kept in the loop. Regular updates. You have my word. After they left, Marcus and I stood in the parking lot. You really think it's possible, he asked, that Bigfoot is real? I think, I said, that the word real might not be adequate for what we're dealing with. But yes, I think there are creatures in these mountains that science hasn't cataloged yet. And I think our job is to protect them just like we protect the bears and elk and everything else. Even if they're dangerous. I thought about the creature in the cave, the intelligence in its eyes, the moment of understanding between us. Everything in nature is dangerous when threatened or protecting its family. That doesn't make it evil, it makes it alive. I drove back to my station as midnight approached, my mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. The video would change things. I knew that much. Even keeping it private, word would spread. Other researchers would get involved. Eventually, inevitably, the truth would come out. My grandfather's journal sat on the passenger seat. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, looking out at the dark forest stretched below. Somewhere in those trees, families of creatures were living their lives, following patterns older than human civilization. I opened the journal to the last page where my grandfather had written his final entry. To whoever reads this after I'm gone, these mountains hold secrets that should remain secret. Not because the truth is dangerous, but because some mysteries are meant to be respected, not solved. If you choose to reveal what I've documented here, do it for the right reasons. Do it to protect, not to exploit. Do it to preserve, not to profit. And remember, they were here first. We are the intruders in their world, not the other way around. Whatever you decide, walk softly in these woods. And listen for the silence. That's when they're watching. I closed the journal and looked out at the darkness. Tomorrow, I'd call Dr. Reeves. We'd start the documentation process, build the case for protection, maybe even prepare for the day when the world would have to acknowledge what lived in these mountains. But tonight, I just sat and listened to the forest, listening for that special silence, wondering if somewhere out there they were listening too, and hoping that whatever came next, we'd find a way to share this world without destroying each other in the process. I never should have ignored the warnings about Salchwa Point. The memory of that day in 2008 still haunts me, clinging to my thoughts like the thick morning fog that blanketed Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was 34 then, working forestry with a state contract to map endangered plant species across the region. My name's Clyde Red Bear, Apache on my father's side, Chippewa on my mother's. Mom always said I inherited Dad's stubborn streak, which probably explains why I disregarded every story, every warning I'd ever heard about those woods. Most days my job was solitary and predictable. I'd hike for miles documenting soil patterns and vegetation, rarely encountering anyone else. The isolation suited me. I'd developed a reputation as reliable but not particularly sociable, the kind of guy who got the job done without unnecessary conversation. That particular Tuesday in late September started differently. My supervisor called the night before, informing me I'd be paired with an intern named Marcus for the Salchwa Point expedition. Kid's eager. Studying conservation biology at Northern Michigan University. Show him the ropes, will you? He could use the field experience. I grunted an affirmative, not thrilled about having company, but not bothered enough to argue. When I pulled my weathered Ford Ranger into the forestry department parking lot the next morning, I spotted him immediately. Tall, lanky, early 20s with an expensive-looking backpack and boots that hadn't seen enough trail to develop proper creases. Marcus Walsh, he introduced himself, extending his hand with an enthusiastic grip. Really appreciate you taking me along, Mr. Red Bear. I've read your reports on the native medicinal plants in the region. Fascinating methodology. His enthusiasm was unexpected. Most interns barely knew my name, let alone my work. Just Clyde, I corrected, loading my gear into the truck. We're heading to Salchwa Point. It's about an hour's drive, then we'll be on foot most of the day. Marcus nodded eagerly, climbing into the passenger seat. As we pulled away, he launched into a detailed monologue about his thesis project on conservation economics. The kid was smart, no question, but my God, could he talk. For the entire drive, he barely paused for breath, shifting from academic theories to personal anecdotes to questions about my experience. I answered in brief sentences when required, focusing on the winding road ahead. The first hint of unease came when I turned onto the unmarked dirt road leading to our starting point. Marcus suddenly went quiet. I glanced over and found him staring at the dense pines lining the route, his expression unreadable. "Something wrong?" I asked. He shook his head slightly. "Just, my grandmother used to tell stories about this area. She was Ojibwe, said there were places in these woods where the boundary between worlds gets thin." I grunted non-committally. Every tribe had their legends about forbidden places. My mother had her share of stories too. Warnings passed down through generations about territories where certain spirits dwelled. But I'd been working these forests for 15 years without incident. Respect the land, move with purpose, and nature generally left you alone. That was my philosophy. We parked at the trailhead, a barely visible opening in the thick forest marked only by a faded wooden post. The morning was unusually still. No breeze disturbed the treetops, no birds called from the branches, just the heavy silence of ancient woods. "We'll follow this trail about 3 miles in," I explained, shouldering my pack. "There's a section near the old creek bed where several endangered orchid species have been reported. Our job is to document their distribution and take soil samples." Marcus nodded, checking his GPS unit. "Lead the way." The trail was overgrown, clearly unused for months or possibly years. The further we ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. Tall pines gave way to ancient oaks and maples, their branches forming a canopy so dense that by mid-morning it felt like dusk beneath them. Marcus had resumed his chatter, but even his voice seemed muffled by the heaviness of the air. He was cataloging plants we passed, reciting Latin names and ecological significance with impressive accuracy. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated his knowledge. By noon, we'd covered about 2 miles, stopping occasionally to document plant specimens. I was focused on a patch of ferns when Marcus called out from several yards ahead. "Clyde, you need to see this." Something in his tone made me straighten immediately. Gone was the enthusiastic student. His voice now held a note of confusion, maybe even alarm. I made my way to where he stood, kneeling beside what looked like disturbed earth. "What do you make of this?" he asked, gesturing to the ground before him. I crouched down, studying the marks carefully. Something had gouged deep furrows into the soil. 4 parallel lines about 8 inches apart, too methodical for random animal activity. They weren't bear tracks, too narrow for that. Not wolf, not moose, not anything I recognized from 15 years in these woods. Could be. I started, then stopped myself. In truth, I had no explanation. Marcus snapped a few photos with his digital camera. "It's weird, right? Almost like something was dragged through here, but the pattern is too regular." I nodded, unable to shake the growing sensation of being watched. The forest remained eerily silent around us, as if holding its breath. A cloud passed overhead, momentarily dimming the filtered light that reached the forest floor. "Let's keep moving," I said, standing and adjusting my pack. "We still have ground to cover before heading back." As we continued deeper into the woods, neither of us mentioned the strange markings again, but I noticed Marcus had stopped talking, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by watchful silence. He stayed closer to me now, no longer wandering ahead to examine plants that caught his interest. The air grew colder as we walked, unusually so for September. I checked my watch, just past 1 p.m., yet it felt like late evening beneath the increasingly dense canopy. Shadows seemed to stretch in impossible directions, playing tricks on my peripheral vision. "Do you feel that?" Marcus whispered suddenly, stopping in his tracks. I paused, sensing what he meant before he elaborated. There was a subtle vibration in the ground, almost imperceptible but definitely there, like something large moving in the distance. "Probably just logging equipment on the other side of the ridge," I said, not believing it myself. The nearest active logging site was miles away. Marcus looked unconvinced, but nodded. "Yeah, probably." We pressed on, the trail narrowing until it was barely discernible from the surrounding undergrowth. The trees grew more twisted here, their bark darker, with strange patterns that reminded me of the warnings my mother used to whisper about marked places, boundaries where the old spirits claimed dominion. For the first time in my career, I considered turning back. Something about these woods felt wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. But professional pride kept me moving forward. We had a job to do, data to collect. Besides, what would I tell my supervisor? That the forest gave me the creeps. So we continued deeper into Sulchua Point, unaware that with each step we were crossing into territory where no amount of scientific training or rational thinking would save us from what waited ahead. By early afternoon, the forest had transformed around us. What started as typical Upper Peninsula woodland had subtly shifted into something older, primeval. The trees stood further apart here, their trunks massive and gnarled, covered in lichen patterns I'd never seen in all my years of fieldwork. The air felt dense, almost resistant to our movement, like walking through invisible cobwebs. Marcus had fallen completely silent, his earlier enthusiasm thoroughly dampened. I caught him glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, his hand tightening around the strap of his backpack. "You hearing something?" I asked, pausing to listen. He shook his head, then hesitated. "Not hearing, feeling, like something's off." I knew what he meant. The forest had gone beyond quiet. It felt abandoned, as if every living creature had fled hours ago, leaving just the two of us trespassing in an empty sanctuary. Even the insects had gone silent, no buzz of mosquitoes or flies despite the damp conditions. We continued walking, our footsteps the only sound in the oppressive stillness. The GPS unit occasionally lost signal, forcing us to rely on my compass and map. According to my calculations, we were approaching the creek bed where the rare orchids had been reported. But the landscape didn't match my expectations. "This can't be right," I muttered, checking the map again. "The creek should be just ahead, but the topography is all wrong." Marcus pointed to a depression about 50 yards ahead. "Maybe it's dried up." "It's been a dry summer." I frowned. The creek was spring-fed, documented consistently for decades. It shouldn't have changed course or dried up completely. But as we approached the depression, I realized it wasn't a creek bed at all. It was a long, winding trench, about 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, with smooth sides that looked almost polished. "What could have made this?" Marcus asked, kneeling at the edge. I shook my head, studying the formation. Nothing natural. The walls of the trench were too uniform, too precisely carved into the forest floor. Maybe old mining activity. Even as I suggested it, I knew it was wrong. The Upper Peninsula had its share of abandoned mines, but nothing was documented in this specific area. Besides, this didn't resemble any mining operation I'd ever seen. Marcus reached down, running his fingers along the inner wall of the trench. "It's warm," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "The soil is warm to the touch." I crouched beside him, confirming his observation. Despite the cool autumn air, the walls of the trench radiated heat like they'd been baking in summer sun. But here, beneath the dense canopy where direct sunlight barely penetrated, such warmth was impossible. "Let's take some samples," I suggested, pulling collection vials from my pack. If nothing else, the soil composition might provide some answers later. As Marcus helped collect samples, I noticed more unusual features in our surroundings. The vegetation near the trench showed signs of stress, leaves curled and browned at the edges despite recent rainfall in the region. The ground felt unusually soft underfoot, almost spongy, as if something had altered its composition.
"Look at this," Marcus called, pointing to a patch of soil about 10 feet from the trench.
I moved closer, immediately recognizing what had caught his attention. More of those strange gouges, but fresher this time, the soil still crumbling at the edges, and beside them, a distinct footprint, if you could call it that. It resembled no animal track I'd ever encountered, roughly triangular with what appeared to be 3 pointed digits extending forward and one backward, each leaving a deep impression in the soft earth. "Some kind of bird?" Marcus suggested weakly. I shook my head. The print was massive, at least 15 inches long. No bird makes tracks like this. And look at the depth. Whatever left this was heavy. I took photographs and measurements, trying to maintain a scientific detachment even as my instincts screamed that we were facing something outside my expertise. Native stories from my childhood flooded back. Tales of forest guardians and territorial spirits that took physical form when their domains were violated. "We should mark this location and report it," I said, fighting to keep my voice neutral. "Might be evidence of an undocumented species." Marcus looked skeptical. "An undocumented bipedal species in Michigan. That's unlikely." "I didn't say it was bipedal," I pointed out. "The arrangement could indicate an unusual gait pattern in a known quadruped." Even as I offered the rational explanation, we both knew it was inadequate. The prints didn't match any quadruped native to the region, and the depth suggested something far heavier than any documented wildlife. We continued our survey, finding more trenches intersecting at odd angles throughout the area, creating a complex network beneath the forest floor. Near one junction, we discovered a pile of organic matter, decomposing plant material mixed with what looked disturbingly like fur and small bones. "Owl pellets?" Marcus suggested, poking at the substance with a stick. "Too large," I replied. "And owls don't create middens like this." As we examined the area, I noticed more unusual features: trees with bark stripped in spiral patterns, rocks arranged in configurations that seemed too deliberate to be natural, patches of ground where nothing grew, forming perfect circles in the otherwise lush forest floor. The deeper we ventured, the more the anomalies accumulated. I maintained meticulous notes and photographs, clinging to scientific procedure even as my unease grew. Marcus had stopped offering explanations, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by vigilant silence. By mid-afternoon, we reached a section of forest where the canopy opened slightly, allowing shafts of sunlight to penetrate to the ground. In this improved light, I noticed something disturbing about the trees surrounding us. Many had what appeared to be deep gouges in their trunks, ranging from ground level to heights of 12 or 15 feet. The marks were similar to bear scratches but far deeper and more systematic, often creating geometric patterns across multiple trees. "Bears marking territory?" Marcus asked, tracing one gouge with his fingertips. "Bears don't create patterns," I said, studying the markings. "And these cuts are too clean. Look at the edges, almost like they were made with a tool." As if on cue, a distant sound echoed through the trees, a low resonant scraping that raised the hair on my arms. It lasted only seconds but seemed to come from all directions at once. Marcus froze. "What was that?" I remained still, listening intently. Could be a tree falling against another. But we both knew it wasn't. The sound had a deliberate quality, almost rhythmic, like something large dragging across a hard surface. "Maybe we should head back," Marcus suggested, checking his watch. "It'll be getting dark in a few hours." Under normal circumstances, I would have pressed on. Our survey was incomplete and we'd barely collected half the data we came for. But nothing about these woods felt normal anymore. "Yeah," I agreed, surprising myself. "Let's circle back, follow a different route to the trailhead." Relief flashed across Marcus's face.
Good plan.
As we consulted the map to plot our return course, that scraping sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable in the stillness. We both looked up, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched had intensified, prickling between my shoulder blades. "Let's move," I said quietly, pocketing the map. We began heading west, aiming to intersect with the main trail about a mile south of our current position. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, deadfalls blocking our path, undergrowth becoming denser and more tangled. It was as if the forest itself was trying to slow our progress. The scraping sound followed us, always just distant enough that we couldn't identify its source, but persistent. Sometimes it came from ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes from both directions simultaneously. Logic told me it was an acoustic trick, sound waves bouncing off trees and rocks, but it felt purposeful, coordinated. As we navigated a particularly dense thicket, Marcus suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing silently ahead. Through a gap in the foliage about 30 yards distant, something moved, a dark shape, substantial but indistinct, sliding between tree trunks with an unnatural fluidity. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, squinting to catch another glimpse, but whatever it was had vanished. "Probably a bear," I said, not believing it myself. It was standing upright. The statement hung between us, neither of us willing to explore its implications. We adjusted our course slightly, giving the area a wide berth. The sounds continued intermittently, sometimes accompanied by a deeper vibration that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. With each passing minute, the forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath becoming visible in the cooling air. According to my watch, it was only 4 p.m., but it felt like evening was closing in rapidly. We increased our pace, pushing through the underbrush with growing urgency. My mental map of the area had become unreliable, landmarks didn't match my expectations, distances seemed compressed or expanded unpredictably. Even the compass behaved erratically, the needle swinging wildly before settling in directions that contradicted my instinctual sense of orientation. "I think we're lost," Marcus finally said, stating what I'd been reluctant to admit. "Not lost," I countered, "just temporarily disoriented. The trail has to be west of us." But west had become a meaningless concept in these woods. The sun was now completely obscured by clouds, and the forest had taken on a uniform dimness that erased shadows and depth perception. We pushed on, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound between the massive trees. The scraping sounds had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that felt even more threatening. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, calculating. As we rounded a bend in the trail, Marcus suddenly stopped, his body tensing. "Clyde," he whispered, pointing ahead. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. About 50 yards ahead, the trees opened into what appeared to be a clearing, but what drew our attention was what surrounded it. Arranged in a perfect circle around the perimeter, spaced at regular intervals, were what looked like cairns, stacks of stones and other materials rising from the forest floor. But as we drew closer, I realized with growing horror that they weren't just stones. They were bones. Countless bones of various sizes, meticulously stacked and arranged into tower-like structures that rose 8 or 9 feet from the ground. Some appeared to be animal remains, deer antlers, wolf skulls, the curved ribs of large mammals, but others were unmistakably human, femurs, pelvic bones, craniums with empty eye sockets staring outward from these macabre monuments. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. then caught himself. I couldn't respond, my throat constricting as I took in the scale of the ossuary before us. There were dozens of these bone towers, each seemingly arranged according to some incomprehensible pattern. And at the center of the clearing stood something else, a structure different from the others, larger and more complex. "We need to leave," I said, finding my voice at last. "Now." But even as I spoke, that scraping sound returned louder, closer, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. Marcus and I exchanged a single glance, understanding passing between us without words. We turned and began retracing our steps, moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the undergrowth. Behind us, something emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. I caught only a glimpse, a dark shape, massive and distorted, moving with a terrible purposeful grace toward the central structure. I didn't look back again, focusing solely on the path ahead and the increasingly desperate need to find our way out of these haunted woods before nightfall. The afternoon had descended into a premature twilight by the time we'd put a quarter-mile between ourselves and that horrific bone-lined clearing. My heart hammered against my ribs as we pushed through the underbrush, no longer concerned with stealth, focused only on distance. Marcus stayed close behind me, his breathing ragged and panicked. "What the hell did we just see?" he gasped when we finally paused, sheltering in the shadow of a massive fallen oak. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent response. Nothing in my 15 years of forestry work had prepared me for the grotesque display we'd witnessed. Those weren't hunting trophies, or the random accumulation of scavenger kills. They were deliberate constructions, monuments built with methodical precision. "We need to contact the authorities," Marcus continued, his voice cracking. "Those were human remains back there. This could be some kind of serial killer dumping ground." The rational explanation should have been comforting, but we both knew it fell short. No killer, no matter how deranged, could account for the scale of what we'd seen, or the impossible arrangement of those bone structures, some balanced in configurations that defied physics. "First, we focus on getting out," I said, checking my compass again. The needle continued its erratic spinning, rendering it useless. We follow the declining slope. Water flows downhill, and the creek feeds into the main river. If we find water, we find our way out. Marcus nodded, clinging to this practical plan. We set off again, moving as quickly as the dense undergrowth allowed. The forest had changed again, the massive ancient trees giving way to younger, closely packed pines that clawed at our clothing and scratched our exposed skin. The ground beneath our feet had become increasingly soft and damp, suggesting we were indeed moving toward lower elevation. That's when we heard it again, that wet, dragging sound, now accompanied by a deep rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It came from behind us, moving parallel to our course but staying just out of sight among the trees. "It's following us," Marcus whispered, his face pale in the fading light. "Keep moving," I urged, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Don't look back." We increased our pace, nearly jogging now despite the treacherous footing. The sounds pursued us, sometimes falling behind, sometimes circling ahead, as if our tracker was toying with us, herding us in a specific direction. I realized with growing dread that we might be walking into a trap, but the alternative, stopping or changing course, seemed equally dangerous. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we stumbled upon what I first took to be salvation, a small wooden structure nestled among the trees ahead. As we drew closer, I recognized it as an old trapper's cabin, weathered and apparently abandoned, but still standing. "Thank God," Marcus breathed. "Maybe there's a radio, or supplies, or—" "Wait," I cautioned, studying the cabin with growing unease. Something about it felt wrong, the angle of the roof slightly off, the proportions subtly distorted, and surrounding it, barely visible in the gathering gloom, were more of those strange gouges in the earth forming concentric circles around the structure. But we had little choice. The sky had darkened to deep purple, and genuine night would fall within minutes. Whatever was tracking us through the woods, I had no desire to face it in darkness. "We'll check it out," I decided, "but stay alert." We approached cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt, a woefully inadequate weapon against whatever had constructed those bone towers, but better than nothing. The cabin's single window was dark, its glass long since shattered. The wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a high-pitched whine that seemed obscenely loud in the forest silence. The interior was a single room, dark and musty. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, and the beam revealed Spartan furnishings, a rusted metal cot against one wall, a small table with one broken leg, a cast-iron stove blackened with decades of use. "Check for anything useful," I instructed, moving to the windows to secure them as best I could. Marcus swept his light across the room, stopping suddenly on the far wall. "Clyde," he called, his voice tight. "You need to see this." I turned, following his beam to where it illuminated the rough-hewn logs of the back wall. Carved into the wood, covering nearly the entire surface, were symbols. hundreds of them, overlapping and interconnected. Some resembled letters from alphabets I couldn't identify. Others were pictographs depicting crude humanoid figures with elongated limbs and misshapen heads. But most disturbing were the larger designs that incorporated these symbols into sprawling mandalas of incomprehensible complexity. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his light tracing the patterns. "Some kind of code?" I shook my head slowly. Some of the symbols tugged at my memory, similar to but distinct from petroglyphs I'd seen on Anishinaabe territories. These carried a different energy. The lines cut deeper and more frantic, as if carved in desperate haste or manic fervor. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't think this cabin belonged to a trapper." Marcus continued examining the wall, his academic curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "The patterns seemed to radiate from this central figure," he noted, pointing to a large symbol that resembled an inverted tree with writhing roots extending upward instead of branches. "Almost like a map, or a..." He never finished the sentence. Outside, perhaps 20 yards from the cabin, something heavy moved through the underbrush branches, snapping, earth compressing under substantial weight. We both froze, listening as the sounds circled the clearing, methodical and unhurried. "Kill the light," I whispered. Marcus switched off his flashlight, plunging us into near-total darkness. Only the faintest gray illumination filtered through the broken window, barely enough to make out each other's silhouettes. We stood motionless, hardly daring to breathe, as the sounds outside grew closer, then stopped directly in front of the cabin door. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, pregnant with malevolent anticipation. I could feel Marcus trembling beside me, hear the shallow, rapid pattern of his breathing. My own heart pounded so violently I was certain it must be audible outside. Then came a new sound, a low, wet clicking. That might have been laughter if filtered through a throat never meant for human speech. It rose and fell in a deliberate rhythm, almost musical in its obscene cadence. Something scraped against the outer wall, testing the structure's integrity. "The door," I mouthed silently to Marcus, gesturing toward the entrance. It had no lock, no bar, nothing to prevent whatever lurked outside from entering. Understanding immediately, Marcus moved with me toward the door. We pressed our shoulders against it, bracing our feet against the uneven floorboards. The wood felt thin and insubstantial beneath my palms, hardly a barrier at all. Outside, the clicking stopped. For several heartbeats, there was only silence, heavy with expectation. Then the door bulged inward with terrific force, nearly throwing us off our feet. We pushed back, straining against the pressure. Wood splintered along the frame as another impact threatened to tear the door from its hinges. "The table," I hissed. "Wedge it against the door." Marcus scrambled for the broken table, dragging it across the floor. Together we tilted it against the door, bracing its legs against the opposite wall to create a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't hold against determined assault, but it might buy us precious minutes. No sooner had we secured the table than something struck the cabin's side wall with such force that the entire structure shuddered. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling as the assault continued, moving methodically around the perimeter, testing for weaknesses. "There must be another way out," Marcus whispered desperately, scanning the cabin's interior. I spotted a small trapdoor in the ceiling, likely access to a storage loft. "There," I pointed. "Give me a boost." Marcus made a stirrup with his hands, lifting me toward the ceiling. I pushed against the trapdoor, relieved when it gave way with minimal resistance. Pulling myself up, I found a small storage space beneath the peaked roof, empty save for a few moldering burlap sacks. Most importantly, part of the roof had collapsed, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. "Come on," I called down softly, extending my arm to pull Marcus up. He had just grasped my hand when the cabin's back wall exploded inward, showering the room with splintered wood and debris. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something massive filling the newly created breach, a shape of impossible proportions, its outline seeming to warp and shift even as I stared at it. 2 points of cold luminescence glowed where eyes should be, fixing on us with predatory intensity. Marcus screamed, a sound of pure animal terror that cut through the night. His grip on my hand tightened convulsively as I strained to pull him up, but something had seized his legs, dragging him backward with inexorable strength. I braced myself against the trapdoor frame, pulling with all my might, feeling the tendons in my shoulder threaten to tear from the effort. For one horrible moment we were suspended in equilibrium. Marcus stretched between my desperate grip and the unseen force below. Then his hand slipped from mine, slick with sweat and terror, and he fell back into the darkness of the cabin. His scream transformed into something worse, a bubbling liquid sound abruptly cut short. Instinct took over. I scrambled through the roof opening, heedless of the jagged edges that tore at my clothing and skin, emerging onto the sloped roof and sliding down to drop into the clearing beyond. The night air hit my lungs like ice water, shocking me into motion. I ran blindly into the forest, pursued by sounds no human throat could produce, a symphony of clicks, hisses, and that terrible wet laughter echoing through the trees. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst, stumbling through underbrush and crashing into low-hanging branches that lashed my face and tore at my eyes. Behind me, always behind me, came that dragging sound, patient, relentless, drawing incrementally closer with each passing minute. Eventually I collapsed at the base of a massive pine, physically incapable of moving further. Blood trickled from dozens of scratches across my face and hands. My ankle throbbed where I'd twisted it in a hidden root hole. Leaning against the rough bark, I strained to hear any sounds of pursuit, but the forest had gone silent again, that expectant, watching silence that had preceded each encounter. As my breathing gradually steadied, rational thought began to reassert itself. Marcus was gone, that much was certain. The realization brought a wave of nausea and self-loathing. I had let go. I had fled. Whatever happened to him in that cabin, I had abandoned him to face it alone. But beneath the guilt lay a more pragmatic concern. I was hopelessly lost in these woods, without light, without reliable navigation, and with something hunting me that defied all natural explanation. My only hope lay in finding my way back to the trail before dawn, before exhaustion rendered me incapable of movement. With shaking hands, I checked my pockets, taking inventory of my meager resources. The compass was useless, but I still had my knife, a lighter, and half a protein bar. No flashlight, no map, no water, it would have to be enough. Rising painfully to my feet, I oriented myself as best I could without stars or landmarks, choosing a direction that I hoped would lead toward lower elevation. As I prepared to move, a sound stopped me cold, that familiar wet scraping now directly behind me. I turned slowly, knife clutched in my trembling hand, and faced the thing that had emerged from between the trees just yards away. In the darkness, its form remained mercifully indistinct, a hulking silhouette of impossible angles and proportions, its shoulders too broad and jointed wrongly, its limbs too long and articulated in places limbs shouldn't bend. But its eyes, those I could see clearly, 2 points of phosphorescent light that contained an intelligence as ancient and cold as the void between stars. It regarded me with those terrible eyes, head tilting at an angle that suggested curiosity rather than imminent attack. Then it made that clicking sound again, a complex pattern that almost seemed like language. One elongated limb extended toward me, ending in what might have been fingers or claws or something for which human language has no adequate term. I raised my knife, a futile gesture against this creature, but defiance was all I had left. It paused, those luminous eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a motion too swift to follow, it lunged forward, and the night dissolved into pain and darkness and the sound of my own screaming. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost meaning in those dark woods, minutes stretching into what felt like hours as I crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs. My lungs burned, each breath tearing through my chest like fire. My legs moved mechanically, driven by pure animal terror rather than conscious will. The thing I still struggle to call it a creature, as that word implies something natural, something that belongs in our world, pursued me with relentless patience. Sometimes I could hear it directly behind me, branches snapping under its weight. Other times the sounds came from my left or right as if it were hurting me in a specific direction. Most terrifying were the moments of complete silence when I knew it was still there, watching, calculating, toying with me. I had seen it clearly only once, in that moment outside the cabin, and my mind rebelled against forming a coherent image from those fragments of perception. Its proportions followed no natural blueprint, too many joints, limbs that bent at impossible angles, a hide that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. Even now, years later, I can only describe impressions, the suggestion of a massive hunched form, limbs too long and articulated wrongly, a head, if it could be called that seemed to change shape as it moved. What remains most vivid are those eyes, cold points of luminescence that held an intelligence so alien and ancient that meeting their gaze felt like staring into an abyss of evolutionary divergence. A branch of life that developed in parallel to our own but followed radically different principles. As I fled through the darkened forest, my mind cycled through explanations, each less plausible than the last. A bear deformed by radiation or chemical exposure, an undocumented predator, somehow overlooked by science despite its size and distinctive characteristics. A hallucination induced by toxic spores from some rare fungus we'd disturbed. None of these rationalities held up against what I'd witnessed. The methodical arrangement of those bone structures, the symbols carved into the cabin walls, the obvious intelligence behind its pursuit. This was no mindless predator operating on instinct. It was hunting me with purpose and strategy. I stumbled into a shallow creek, the icy water shocking me momentarily out of my panic. Water, direction. Following the flow would lead downhill, eventually to larger bodies of water and perhaps civilization. It was the most basic rule of wilderness survival, one I clung to now like a lifeline. Splashing downstream, I used the water to mask my scent and sound, moving as quickly as the slippery rocks allowed. For a brief period, the pursuit sounds faded, giving me hope that I'd gained some advantage. Then I heard it again, that wet, dragging sound, now moving parallel to the creek, keeping pace effortlessly despite the rough terrain. The creek broadened, deepening in places to small pools where the water reflected the faint starlight that penetrated the canopy. In one such pool, I caught a glimpse of movement beneath the surface, something large displacing water as it passed just inches below where I stood. I froze, watching in horror as the disturbance circled my legs before continuing downstream, faster than any fish or normal aquatic creature could move. It was in the water, it was in the goddamn water. I scrambled up the bank, abandoning the creek strategy and plunging back into the forest. My direction was now completely arbitrary, just away from that thing that seemed capable of navigating any environment with equal facility. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling face first into the leaf litter. Pain shot through my ankle, accompanied by the distinct pop of overstressed tendons. I bit back a scream, knowing it would only hasten the inevitable, and tried to stand. My ankle buckled immediately, unable to bear weight. I was done. No more running, no more escape. The realization brought a strange calm, the fatalistic acceptance of prey that knows the chase is over. I dragged myself to the base of a massive oak, propping my back against its trunk and drawing my hunting knife, a pathetic defense, but I wouldn't meet my end cowering. The forest had gone silent again, that watching silence that preceded each appearance of the creature. I strained my eyes against the darkness, trying to pinpoint where it would emerge. Nothing moved among the trees. No branches swayed, no undergrowth rustled. Yet I could feel its presence, a heaviness in the air like the pressure before a violent storm. "What do you want?" I called out, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "What the hell are you?" No response came, but the silence itself seemed to deepen, as if the very air were holding its breath. Then gradually I became aware of a vibration. Not a sound exactly, but a physical sensation passing through the ground into my body. It increased in intensity until the leaf litter around me danced with its force, small stones bouncing on the forest floor. From the darkness directly ahead, something moved toward me, a shape blacker than the surrounding night, dimensions shifting as it approached. It stopped about 15 feet away, just at the edge of visibility, its form seeming to blur and refocus constantly, as if my eyes couldn't properly process what they were seeing. Those luminous eyes fixed on me with terrible intelligence. The thing made that clicking sound again, a complex pattern that rose and fell in distinct phrases. Then it extended one elongated limb, pointing first at me, then at the ground beside it, in what seemed unmistakably like a command. I tightened my grip on the knife, preparing for its rush. But it remained stationary, repeating the pointing gesture with deliberate patience as if dealing with a particularly slow child. After several repetitions, I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't preparing to attack, it was communicating. It wanted me to approach it voluntarily. "No," I said, the word barely audible even to my own ears. The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle, those eyes narrowing slightly. Then it made a new sound, a deep resonant vibration that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and reverberate directly through my skeleton. With it came a sensation of crushing pressure, as if the air itself were compressing around me, forcing the breath from my lungs. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I struggled to breathe. The knife fell from nerveless fingers as I clawed at my throat, fighting against the invisible force constricting it. Just as consciousness began to fade, the pressure released suddenly, leaving me gasping and retching on the forest floor. A warning then. A demonstration of power. The creature remained motionless, watching my recovery with what might have been scientific curiosity. When I had regained some semblance of composure, it repeated the pointing gesture, more emphatically this time. The message was clear: follow willingly, or be compelled by force. With no viable alternatives, I struggled to my feet, wincing as my injured ankle protested the movement. Using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, I limped forward, stopping several yards from the creature. Even at this distance, its wrongness was overwhelming. The way its outline seemed to shimmer and distort, as if its physical form were merely an approximation of something my mind couldn't properly comprehend. It turned and began moving into the forest, pausing to ensure I followed. Each step was agony, my ankle throbbing in time with my racing heart, but the memory of that crushing force kept me moving. We proceeded through the darkness, the creature occasionally adjusting its pace to accommodate my labored progress. Our destination became apparent as we approached a familiar location. The clearing ringed with bone structures that Marcus and I had discovered earlier. But now in the deeper darkness, the clearing had transformed. Those bone cairns seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence, casting the entire area in sickly blue-green light. At the center, where earlier I'd glimpsed some larger structure, now stood something that defied rational description. It resembled a doorway or arch, constructed from interlocking bones of various sizes, rising perhaps 12 feet from the forest floor. Within the arch was not the expected view of the forest beyond, but a darkness deeper than the surrounding night, a void that seemed to bend the very light around it, creating an optical distortion that made my eyes water and my head throb when I tried to focus on it. The creature guided me to the edge of the clearing, then stopped, making that complex clicking sound again. Other sounds answered from the darkness, similar patterns coming from multiple directions. As my eyes adjusted to the eerie illumination, I realized with mounting dread that we were not alone. Shapes moved among the trees surrounding the clearing. 5 additional creatures of similar proportion to my captor, emerging from hiding places that should have been too small to conceal their bulk. They converged on the clearing, moving with that same fluid grace that suggested joints and musculature arranged according to principles entirely foreign to earthly biology. As they entered the phosphorescent light, I caught glimpses of their forms, each similar in general shape but with distinct variations, like different breeds of the same impossible species. Some moved on, what appeared to be multiple limbs, others propelled themselves with undulating lower bodies, all shared those luminous eyes filled with cold intelligence. They formed a loose circle around me, exchanging those clicking communications in patterns that suggested language. One approached, extending a limb toward my face. I flinched back, but it moved with blinding speed, seizing my jaw with appendages that felt like wet leather stretched over steel. It turned my head from side to side, examining me with clinical detachment. Another approached, this one smaller but moving with greater agility. It circled me, prodding at my clothing and equipment with evident curiosity. When it reached toward my chest pocket where I kept my Forestry Service ID, I instinctively moved to protect it. The creature reacted instantly, producing that same resonant vibration that had earlier constricted my breathing. This time the pressure localized in my outstretched arm, forcing it down to my side with irresistible strength. Message received. I remained motionless as it extracted the ID, turning the laminated card and its elongated digits, studying the photo and text with apparent interest. After a moment it made a sharp clicking sound and passed the ID to another creature which examined it similarly before discarding it carelessly on the forest floor. Throughout this inspection I fought to maintain some semblance of scientific observation, clinging to professional detachment as a shield against paralyzing terror. These were intelligent beings, capable of complex communication and coordinated action. They displayed curiosity, methodical behavior, and clear social organization. Whatever they were, whether undiscovered terrestrial species or something far stranger, they were not mindless predators. This realization offered cold comfort as they completed their examination and began herding me toward that impossible arch at the clearing's center. As we approached, the darkness within it seemed to deepen, shifting and swirling like a liquid void. The air grew colder, carrying a smell I can only describe as the absence of smell, a negative space where normal sensory input should exist. My captor pushed me forward until I stood directly before the arch, close enough to feel a subtle pull from the darkness within, as if it generated its own gravity. The clicking communications intensified, taking on a rhythmic quality that reminded me disturbingly of chanting. The bone structures surrounding the clearing began to pulse in time with this rhythm, their phosphorescence brightening and dimming in coordinated waves. I knew with sudden, absolute certainty that they intended me to enter that arch, that terrible doorway to wherever these creatures originated. And I knew with equal certainty that doing so would mean the end of anything recognizable as human existence. In that moment of clarity, survival instinct overrode pain and fear. I twisted suddenly, breaking away from my distracted captor and lunging toward the gap between two of the surrounding creatures. My injured ankle screamed in protest but held long enough for me to stagger into the tree line, blind panic lending me strength I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, those clicking voices rose in what could only be alarm, followed by the sounds of pursuit crashing through the undergrowth. I ran without direction or strategy, driven by the primal need to put distance between myself and that abominable doorway. Each step sent daggers of pain up my leg, but fear pushed me forward, deeper into the lightless forest. I don't know how long I fled, or how I evaded recapture in my injured state. Perhaps they expected me to tire quickly. Perhaps something about the forest itself helped conceal my trail. Or perhaps in their alien psychology my desperate flight constituted some form of test or trial, amusing to observe rather than immediately thwart. Whatever the reason, I eventually found myself alone in the darkness, leaning against a tree trunk, my body trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. The pursuit sounds had receded, replaced by the normal nocturnal chorus of insects and wind through branches. I had escaped, temporarily at least. With my ankle now swollen to twice its normal size, Continuing to run was impossible. My only option was to find shelter and hope to survive until daylight, when perhaps the creature's activities would be limited. In the dim starlight filtering through the canopy, I spotted a dense thicket nearby. Not ideal protection, but better than remaining exposed. I crawled into the center of the brambles, heedless of the thorns tearing at my clothing and skin, and curled into the smallest target possible. There, surrounded by tangled vegetation, I waited for dawn, straining to detect any sound of approaching predators while fighting the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. As the adrenaline ebbed, the full horror of the night's events crashed down upon me. Marcus was gone, taken or killed by these things for purposes I couldn't begin to comprehend. I had been examined like a laboratory specimen, nearly forced through some kind of doorway to an unknown destination, and somewhere in these woods at least 6 of those creatures still moved with terrible purpose, perhaps even now searching for their escaped subject. Sleep was impossible, yet my battered body demanded rest. I drifted in and out of a twilight state, jerking fully awake at every snapping twig or rustling leaf, certain each time that discovery was imminent. During one such period of semi-consciousness, I became aware of a gradual lightening of the forest, not dawn yet, but the first hint that night was finally retreating. With this faint illumination came an unexpected sound, distant but unmistakable. A vehicle engine, somewhere far below my position. Civilization, safety, or at least the chance of it. Gathering the last reserves of my strength, I crawled from the thicket and oriented myself toward the sound. The forest sloped downward in that direction, suggesting a road in the valley below. If I could reach it before the creatures found me again, I might survive to tell this impossible story. And so began the most painful journey of my life. Half crawling, half dragging myself down the forested slope using trees for support and crude walking sticks fashioned from fallen branches. Each movement was an exercise in agony. My injured ankle now completely useless, forcing me to essentially hop on one leg while balancing with my makeshift crutches. The forest seemed to conspire against my progress, throwing up obstacles at every turn. Dense underbrush, hidden depressions, fallen trees too large to easily circumvent. Yet the sound of engines grew gradually louder, confirming I was moving in the right direction. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions for the hunted, began to flicker within me. As gray pre-dawn light filtered through the trees, I caught glimpses of what appeared to be a paved surface through the thinning forest ahead. A road, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, so close. Yet in my condition, it might as well have been 10 miles. I pressed on, abandoning caution for speed, making more noise than was wise in my desperate push toward safety. The road was now clearly visible, a 2-lane highway cutting through the valley below, with occasional vehicles passing in the early morning light. 200 yards, 150. The forest was thinning, transitioning to scrubby second growth near the roadside. 100 yards. I could distinguish individual vehicles now, mostly logging trucks and the occasional passenger car. 75 yards. That's when I heard it again, that wet dragging sound directly behind me. I didn't need to turn to know what followed, could feel those luminous eyes boring into my back with predatory intensity. It had found me, tracked me through miles of dense forest despite my desperate attempts at evasion. 50 yards from safety, I made a final desperate push, abandoning my makeshift crutches and simply hurling myself forward, half falling down the remaining slope. Behind me, the creature closed the distance with terrifying speed, no longer bothering with stealth. I could hear branches snapping under its weight, feel the ground vibrate with its approach. 25 yards. The road was right there, morning sunlight glinting off the asphalt. A logging truck approached from the south, moving at considerable speed. If I could just reach the roadside in time to flag it down. 10 yards. I was crawling now, my body having finally surrendered to exhaustion and injury. The creature was almost upon me. I could smell its strange, acrid odor, hear its clicking communication, presumably calling to its companions. 5 yards. The truck was passing, its driver oblivious to the life-or-death drama unfolding just beyond his field of vision. I summoned the last dregs of my strength, raised myself to my knees, and waved frantically, a hoarse cry tearing from my raw throat. The truck's brakes squealed as the driver spotted me, the massive vehicle slowing and pulling onto the shoulder perhaps 50 yards beyond my position. Behind me, the creature hesitated, suddenly confronted with potential witnesses in the harsh light of dawn. I crawled the final distance to the road's edge, collapsing onto the gravel shoulder as the truck driver jogged back toward me, shouting questions I couldn't process through the roaring in my ears. I turned my head, seeking a final glimpse of my pursuer, but the tree line stood empty now. The creature had vanished, retreating back into the depths of the forest from which it had emerged. As the driver reached me, his weathered face contorting with alarm at my condition, I felt consciousness finally slipping away. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was looking past him, back toward those accursed woods, and seeing movement among the distant trees, not the creature itself, but the subtle shifting of branches that suggested something large withdrawing deeper into shadow. Then there was only blackness and the blessed release of oblivion. I awoke to the antiseptic smell of a hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment, and the dull throb of injuries partially masked by medication. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh illumination a stark contrast to the darkness of Sulchwa Point. For several disoriented moments, I couldn't reconcile these surroundings with my last conscious memories. A nurse noticed my stirring and approached, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. "Welcome back," she said, adjusting my IV drip. "You've been out for nearly 20 hours. Doctor will want to know you're awake." "Where?" My voice emerged as a croak, my throat raw from screaming and dehydration. "Marquette General Hospital," she replied, offering a plastic cup of water. "Logging truck brought you in yesterday morning. You were in pretty rough shape." As awareness returned, so did the memories. The bone towers, the cabin, Marcus's scream, those luminous eyes watching from the darkness. I tried to sit up, panic surging through me. There was someone with me. Marcus, the intern. Did they find him? Is he here? The nurse gently pushed me back against the pillows. "Easy now. You were alone when they found you. Highway Patrol sent a team to search the area after you were brought in, but I haven't heard anything about finding anyone else." Of course they hadn't. Whatever fate had befallen Marcus, it wasn't one that would leave evidence easily discovered by a routine search party. A hollow ache spread through my chest, guilt mingling with the physical pain of my injuries. A doctor arrived soon after, a grave-faced woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Rivera. She examined me thoroughly, cataloging my injuries with clinical detachment: severe sprain to the right ankle with partial tendon tear, multiple lacerations and contusions, mild hypothermia, dehydration, exhaustion. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Redbear," she concluded, making notes on her tablet. "Can you tell me what happened out there?" The question hung in the air between us. What could I possibly say? That ancient inhuman creatures stalked Michigan's forests, building monuments from bones and opening doorways to somewhere else. That they had taken or killed my intern and nearly done the same to me. The truth would sound like the ravings of a man in shock or suffering hallucinations. "Got separated from my partner during a forestry survey," I said finally. "Fell and injured my ankle. Got disoriented trying to find my way out." Dr. Rivera studied me over her glasses, clearly recognizing the inadequacy of this explanation but professional enough not to press. "The police will want to take a statement once you're more stable. They've organized a search for your missing colleague." I nodded, knowing the search would yield nothing. "When can I leave?" "We'd like to keep you under observation for at least another day. That ankle needs proper immobilization and we're still concerned about potential infection in some of those deeper lacerations." After she left, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened and what might come next. Would the creatures remain in their territory, or would they pursue me now that I'd seen them? What was that doorway in the clearing, and where did it lead? And most troublingly, why had they released me when capture had seemed certain? My thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a police officer, a young state trooper who introduced himself as Officer Kopinski. He pulled up a chair beside my bed, notebook in hand. "Mr. Redbear, I understand you're still recovering, but we need some information to help locate your missing colleague." I provided Marcus's full name and what little I knew of his background. Graduate student at Northern Michigan University, studying conservation biology, assigned as my intern for the Sulchwa Point survey. When asked about the circumstances of our separation, I repeated the sanitized version I'd given Dr. Rivera, adding fabricated details about areas we'd already searched to direct the rescue teams away from the clearing in the cabin. "And you have no idea what might have happened to him?" Kopinski pressed, clearly sensing omissions in my account. I shook my head. "We got separated in the dark. I called for him, but..." I let the sentence trail off, not trusting myself to elaborate convincingly. The officer made a few more notes, then closed his notebook. "We'll continue searching, but I should warn you. Those woods are extensive, and if he's injured and unable to signal..." He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. After Kopinski left, a new visitor arrived. My supervisor from the forestry department, Alan Richards. He looked haggard, his normally neat appearance disheveled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "Jesus, Clyde," he said, dropping heavily into the chair. "What the hell happened out there?" Again, I provided the simplified version, but Alan knew me too well to accept it fully. We'd worked together for nearly a decade, and he'd never known me to get disoriented in familiar territory, regardless of conditions. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "the university is raising hell about their missing student. There's talk of negligence, inadequate safety protocols. I need to know exactly what went down." I met his gaze steadily. "I told you what happened, Alan. We got separated. I got injured. End of story." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "The area's been placed off limits pending the investigation. No one's allowed in until they either find the kid or, well, until the search is called off. Good, I said, perhaps too emphatically. That's probably for the best. Alan's eyebrows rose slightly at my tone, but he didn't pursue it. Instead, he switched to practicalities. My medical leave, paperwork for the incident report, arrangements for my transportation home once discharged. Throughout the conversation, I could sense his unasked questions, his awareness that I was withholding significant information. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Whatever really happened out there, Clyde? Was it something that might endanger the search teams? The question caught me off guard. I considered lying, then decided against it. These people were walking into danger blindly. They deserved at least a warning, however cryptic. Tell them to stay out of the old-growth section near the creek, I said carefully. And if they find a cabin, don't enter it, just don't. Alan nodded slowly, accepting this bizarre advice without further question. A testament to our years of mutual trust. I'll pass it along. Rest up, Clyde. After he left, I spent hours staring at the window, watching daylight fade into dusk. Sleep evaded me despite the sedatives coursing through my system. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bone towers, that impossible doorway, those luminous eyes watching with alien intelligence. The next day brought a parade of additional visitors, more police officers, a representative from the university asking pointed questions about the circumstances of Marcus's disappearance, even a reporter from the local paper whom I refused to speak with. By afternoon, I had retreated into monosyllabic responses, claiming exhaustion to avoid detailed questioning. Dr. Rivera, sensing my deteriorating mental state, limited further visits and arranged for a consultation with the hospital's psychiatric department. The psychiatrist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Chen, recognized the signs of acute trauma and recommended against pushing me for a complete account of events until I had time to process the experience. Whatever happened in those woods clearly left psychological wounds alongside the physical ones, she explained to the frustrated detective who had replaced Officer Kapinski. Forcing him to relive it now could cause additional trauma. I was discharged 3 days later, my ankle immobilized in a walking boot with prescriptions for pain medication, antibiotics, and sleep aids. Alan arranged for a department vehicle to transport me back to my cabin near Munising, where I lived alone except for an aging retriever named Scout. The search for Marcus continued for another 2 weeks before being officially classified as a recovery operation rather than a rescue. They never found his body. The official report eventually concluded he had likely fallen into one of the numerous sinkholes that pockmarked the karstal landscape of Sulchwa Point, his remains perhaps washed into the extensive underground cave system that honeycombed the region. I didn't correct this assumption. What purpose would it serve other than to destroy my credibility and career? Who would believe the truth? And more dangerously, who might be inspired to investigate that clearing, that cabin, those bone towers for themselves? Instead, I retreated into isolation, taking extended medical leave that gradually transformed into a desk position analyzing survey data rather than collecting it. I never returned to fieldwork, citing my injured ankle as the reason. The truth that I couldn't bear to enter any forest, knowing what might lurk in its depths, remained my secret. In the months that followed, I conducted my own investigation, researching historical records and native legends associated with Sulchwa Point. The area I discovered had a long history of disappearances dating back to the earliest European exploration. Native stories spoke of it as a thin place where entities from elsewhere could cross into our world, a description that aligned disturbingly with that bone-framed doorway I had witnessed. Most tellingly, I found references in Chippewa oral histories to the Watchers at the Threshold, beings who guarded certain sacred or forbidden locations against human trespass. The descriptions, while cloaked in metaphor and spiritual language, contained elements that matched my experience. Creatures of fluid form, with too many joints and cold eyes, their preference for darkness, their ability to move through water and earth with equal facility, their construction of spirit houses from the bones of their victims. These discoveries brought no comfort, only confirmation that what I had encountered was known to indigenous peoples long before European settlement. The creatures were not new to these lands. They had always been here, allowing human civilization to expand around their territories while maintaining their own hidden domains. 6 months after the incident, I received an unexpected package at my office. A battered digital camera in a sealed evidence bag, accompanied by a note from Alan. Found in the search area, it read, "Technically should go to his family, but thought you might want to see it first." Marcus's camera. I stared at it for hours before finding the courage to extract the memory card and view its contents. Most images were what you would expect from a forestry survey. Plant specimens, soil samples, GPS-tagged landscapes. Then came the photographs from that final day. The strange gouges in the earth, the unnatural trench with its polished walls, the twisted trees with their geometric scars, and finally, partially obscured by branches but unmistakable, a glimpse of one of the bone towers at the clearing's edge. But the most disturbing image was the last one taken, according to the timestamp just moments before we fled from the clearing. It showed a section of forest where nothing appeared to be present, just trees and undergrowth. Yet in the upper corner, barely visible, was a distortion in the air, a warping of light and space around what seemed to be empty forest. When I enlarged this section and enhanced the contrast, I nearly dropped the camera. Within that distortion, barely perceptible, was the outline of one of the creatures, its form transparent and wavering, but its eyes clear and focused directly on the camera lens. It had been there, watching us before we even knew we were being stalked. I deleted the images, then physically destroyed the memory card, breaking it into pieces and disposing of them in separate locations. The empty camera I returned to Alan, claiming the card had been damaged and unreadable. He accepted this without question, perhaps relieved to be spared whatever traumatic images it might have contained. Life gradually resumed a semblance of normalcy. I moved to a different town, took a new position with the parks department that kept me firmly behind a desk, began seeing a therapist under the guise of processing grief for my lost colleague. I never mentioned the true nature of what I'd witnessed in those woods, framing my trauma in terms of survivor's guilt and the stress of the ordeal. Years passed. The nightmares receded from nightly terrors to occasional disturbances. I developed routines that allowed me to function: medication, therapy, careful avoidance of triggers like dense forests or darkness. I even managed to form relationships, though none lasted. The weight of my unshared experience created a barrier too substantial to overcome. Then, last month, I received a letter. No return address, just my name and current location inscribed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single page containing a crude drawing of one of the bone towers, and beneath it coordinates for a location in the western Upper Peninsula, far from Solchwa Point, but similarly remote. Below these, a message: "They're spreading, more doorways opening, need your help." I burned the letter immediately, but its contents had already scarred themselves into my memory. Someone else had encountered these creatures, recognized what they were, and somehow connected them to me. The implications were terrifying. Not just that the entities were expanding their territory, but that knowledge of them was spreading among humans. I've spent weeks debating what to do with this information. Report it to authorities. They would dismiss it as the ravings of a traumatized mind, or worse, investigate and send more innocent people into danger. Ignore it. How could I live with myself if others suffered what Marcus did, knowing I might have prevented it? In the end, I've chosen this middle path, recording my experience in full, finally giving honest voice to what I witnessed in those accursed woods. I don't expect to be believed. I don't seek validation or even understanding. This account exists solely as warning and testimony, to be discovered should others encounter these entities and seek answers. As for me, I've made my decision. Tomorrow I leave for the coordinates provided in that anonymous letter. I go prepared this time, not with weapons, which proved useless against these creatures, but with knowledge. I've spent years researching similar phenomena, corresponding discreetly with indigenous elders and cryptozoological researchers, gathering what fragmentary information exists about these entities and their potential vulnerabilities. I harbor no illusions about my chances of success or even survival. But Marcus deserves justice, or at least understanding. And if these doorways are indeed proliferating, someone must document them, must understand what comes through them and why. If you're reading this, it likely means I haven't returned. In that case, heed my warning. There are places in this world where reality thins, where things from elsewhere can cross into our domain. Solchwa Point is one such place. There are others, their numbers potentially growing. Respect the old boundaries, the forgotten territories, the places where even animals fall silent. And if you find yourself in deep woods and sense that watching silence, if you discover strange markings or structures that defy natural explanation, do what I failed to do 17 years ago. Run. Run without looking back. Run until you reach light and civilization and the comforting din of human activity. Because in the dark spaces between trees, in the shadows that move against the wind, in the silence that falls too suddenly across a forest path, they are watching, waiting, their cold, luminous eyes fixed on the next unwitting trespasser to cross their threshold. And unlike me, you may not be allowed to escape to tell your tale.